My name is Joel, in Hebrew Yoel. I live in Israel. I'm currently speaking to you from a city called Harish, which is the kind of the beginning of the north or the end of the center of Israel towards the east. We'll be looking at some maps. So I live very close to the Green Line, very close to the West Bank, but not inside. And I'm living in a country which is going through, and we all are going through something unprecedented. Not just us, also our Palestinian neighbors as well. And it's a very complex, it's a very nuanced, it's a very emotional subject. At the same time, I think for a lot of you in the questions that you've been sending through and asking me are mentioning that for a lot of people, this is seen as something which is very simple, something that's seen as very binary, something that's seen as very obvious, and something that is pulling people poles apart and at each other's throats. So what I'm going to try and do today, as an Israeli, as a tour guide in Israel, as an Israeli, and again, I wrote for all of those of you that saw the sign-up mail, anyone that says that they are objective is not only wrong, but they're probably deliberately trying to push you in one direction or another. I myself, certainly politically, am very confused and in the middle. But nonetheless, I will try my very, very best to let you know when things are in my opinion, let you know when things, I consider those things to be facts. I also appreciate that we have different perspectives. Again, I can't promise to be objective. I'm not, but I can promise to try and be fair. So the first thing that I wanted to speak about is the fact that what we're dealing with now in the region is incredible trauma. We have, even before the events of October the 7th, we're speaking about Israelis and Palestinians. And again, I'm setting Hamas aside here, and we'll speak about why. Israelis and Palestinians are both peoples that are rooted in trauma. Israelis, 75% of Israelis approximately are Jewish. The Jews of Israel, along with the Jews of the world, are very much, in terms of our identity shaped by trauma. And that's not specifically only related to the Holocaust. There are significant portions of Jews around the world who were not present in areas that were directly affected by the Holocaust, but nonetheless, persecution, anti-Semitism, suffering, pain, all of these things are very much part of the Jewish experience. And again, we're not going to be speaking about the Holocaust today, but I've seen on various news, often you've heard this idea that this is the greatest or largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, which is true, which is a fact. And this idea of the trauma and what has happened is not only a singularly difficult event inside Israel for Israelis, but it's also something which evokes a huge amount of pre-existing trauma that is passed down through generations for Israelis and Jews. Should also mention that we're going to be speaking today about the Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and there is also an enormous amount of trauma that is held within Palestinian society. And again, I want to set aside what each of our political opinions are, whether one thinks that you are more right than the other, or the other is more right than you, or whether these different narratives can exist one alongside the other. But what we understand is that even the reactions to what is going on today are conditioned by the trauma of the creation of the State of Israel, which is celebrated on one side and is also seen as a catastrophe for Palestinians as well. This is important to state and understand when we're trying to understand how people are reacting, not about justifying, not about speaking about why things have happened, but understanding how people are reacting. So this is the first thing that I wanted to say. I also, I know there are a number of you who I've guided inside Israel, particularly I think on the presentation today in student groups from around the world. And thank you to joining me for all those that are here. And one of the things and one of the questions that has come up that people have been sending to me is about anti-Semitic events around the world and the way that certain people around the world have, on the one hand, reacted to what they believe to be injustice to Palestinians, but also those that are showing what appears to be an egregious expression of anti-Semitism as well. And one of the things, and again, we're speaking about trauma and about how Israel is reacting and how that plays into how things are seen around the world, is I often speak with groups that I guide, student and political groups that I guide in Israel, and I speak about criticism of Israel. And I want to also try and create some kind of framework to say that, on the one hand, criticism of Israel can be completely and utterly legitimate and justified. I, as an Israeli, can be very critical of my country. Many of us Israelis are, one way or the other. Even right now, whilst everything is going on, criticizing a country, criticizing its government, its policies, its actions, absolutely, completely can be legitimate. At the same time, there is also, and we're seeing a lot of it today, and we'll speak about it, a lot of the wording on the expressions that are coming into the second circle, which in theory shouldn't be connected. One can completely and utterly chastise, criticize, and be angry at Israel, but at the same time, not even consider the idea that this particular nation state amongst the nation states of the world shouldn't exist. The reality is that for many right now, and I know those many Jewish people around the world are very much feeling like this, that very often those two things are coming together, and it does appear that very often that criticism of Israel very often metamorphosizes or comes together with the idea that Israel shouldn't exist, or that there is no right to the existence of a Jewish state, that this particular nation state amongst the nations of the world is uniquely different. And that's also something that we need to consider with the reaction. So I just wanted to put some of these things out there as a framework. Again, I'm also going to say that I'm not going to be showing today graphic images. I'm not going to be going into hugely, I don't want to try and emotionally bring people from one side or another to, I think the emotions are ripe for those people that want to see images of destruction in Gaza and people that have been killed. You can go online and you can find it. For those people that want to see the incredibly videos, even GoPro'd and recorded by the terrorists of Hamas, or the sites that were seen, or the testimonies given by those that went into the Gaza border area and the Jewish and Israeli communities there, with Jewish and Bedouin and different communities there, will have seen many of those images that can't be unseen. So I'm not going to be doing that today. What I'm going to try and do is to present different ideas, facts, try and give a sense of what's going on, and context, and hope that everything else will come together. So I apologize for that long introduction. I hope that was okay, but I did want to put all that out there. So first of all, I wanted to show some maps. So right now you're looking at a map of the Middle East. You can see very, very large Middle East. And if you look just over here, this tiny little part over here in the light blue, this is the state of Israel over here. You can see that it's bordered by Jordan to the east, Syria and Lebanon to the north, Egypt to the south, and Saudi Arabia just below, significantly below. And beneath Saudi Arabia, Yemen over here, Qatar. We're going to be speaking about Iran, Iraq, Turkey. We'll be speaking about these places today. So let me come in a little bit more into the map of Israel. Again, finding a map of Israel that everyone can be universally happy with is also a challenge. So I tried my best. So right now we're looking here at a map of Israel, and we'll speak more about how this map came to be as it is. Again, we can see the surrounding countries. We can see the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt over here, Jordan to the east, the Golan Heights and Syria to the north, Lebanon also to the north. And we can see over here the West Bank over here, and the Gaza Strip over here, right over here. And we'll speak more about, go more in depth into these areas. But right now I want to focus in on Gaza. So first of all, what are we looking at right here? So take aside the purple for a moment. The red that you can see is the Gaza Strip, which is wedged between Israel and Egypt. The Gaza Strip, just to give you some kind of sense of the size of the Gaza Strip. It has a 51-kilometer or 32-mile border with Israel. So you can see to both the east and the north over here, the Mediterranean Sea on the eastern side. And right over here has a 7-mile or 11-kilometer border with Egypt. All in all, it's just under or just around 150 square miles in size. So a relatively small area that we see over here. But also say, if I just bring you up to the second map, or maybe we'll see it a little bit clearer. So Tel Aviv, again, is not on this map over here, but Tel Aviv is about on the tip of my finger. And from Gaza, from the Gaza Strip to Tel Aviv is approximately 70 kilometers or 44 miles, 71 kilometers, 44 miles. That's around an hour. So when you're hearing on the news about how far everything is, just to give a sense that Tel Aviv, and the largest metropolitan urban sprawl in Israel, is in fact in the southern part. If we go down to Rishon LeZion, Holon, all of these areas are approximately 45 minutes drive up from the Gaza Strip, just to give you a sense of how close everything is. And we'll speak more about that as well. Coming back to the map over here, what we're looking at right over here is a map showing the events or what happened on October the 7th. On October the 7th at around 6:30 in the morning, thousands of Hamas terrorists, again, I'm going to use the term, that Hamas terrorists came across over here, which again, we could term it a border. Things are a little bit more complicated. Essentially a border fence or a border barrier fence from the Gaza Strip into the sovereign, internationally recognized borders of the state of Israel. This is very important to mention. Again, I've seen in some news networks describing these villages that you can see around here. These are kibbutzim, moshavim, towns over in this area. I've seen them described as settlements. These are not settlements in the political sense. They're not in areas of West Bank or Gaza Strip. They are in internationally recognized borders of the state of Israel. From the sea, from the Gaza Strip, thousands of Palestinian terrorists came into this area, into all of these different villages and kibbutzim, up around from Nativ HaSara to Kfar Aza. The party, if you've probably heard a lot about the party that was going on, was in the area about on the tip of my finger, just over here next to Kibbutz Be'eri, which was one of the kibbutzim massively affected by what took place. And the purple that you see shows the entire area that the Hamas and Islamic Jihad, two prescribed terrorist organizations, that they came into, entering, again, attacking people on roads, towns, and coming into civilian settlements and murdering people and doing unspeakable deeds. They also kidnapped a significant number of people. As of right now, we understand that approximately 210 people are kidnapped. It may have gone up to 212. The reason why is because there are a significant number of people missing, over 100 people missing in Israel, and it's not. And some of the remains, some of the bodies of those that were murdered have been treated in such a way that it's almost impossible at this stage to actually be able to identify them. Just as bizarre as that sounds. So there are some people that were thought to be kidnapped that were discovered not kidnapped. There are also those that are still being added to the number. Over here you can see Ofakim. Ofakim is an Israeli town over here. It's a development town. So a lot of the population of Ofakim were actually Jews from Arab and North African countries that came in the 1950s after the creation of the State of Israel. From the Arab world. In the Arab world today, there's approximately 3,500 Jews living in the Arab world today. It gives you some kind of sense of that. And we'll speak about the issue of refugees, Palestinian, and those refugees from Jews from Arab countries a little bit later on. So the area that you can see in purple is the area that they came into over in this area. Again, I said I'm not going to show pictures. This is just one of the rooms of a children's bedroom in Kfar Aza, which I thought just to give you some kind of sense. The map that I'm showing you now, again, if you remember, the map that I showed you before is this area is all in purple. And this is Ofakim over here. Following the events that took place, and we'll speak about the huge, in Hebrew we say machdal, like a huge failure in terms of the intelligence and the ability of Israel's security services to react for hours and hours and hours, ultimately, that saw 1,400 Israelis killed in the attacks, predominantly civilians. After that took place, all of this area that you see in yellow has been, take all of the Israeli citizens in this area, be they Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or otherwise, all of the Israeli citizens in this area have been taken out of their homes. This is now a closed military zone. So all of those people have been removed from their homes. We'll speak later on about what's going on in the north of Israel. And again, in the north of Israel, approximately 100,000 people have also now left their homes in the north of Israel. The government of Israel has instructed them to evacuate the area affected by warfare. That's important to say. So again, we'll speak a little bit more about that later on as well. The other thing that I wanted to mention, I spoke about the hostages, and we'll speak more about them. So I'll move on. The other thing I wanted to mention, and we'll speak to it more a little bit later on as well in more detail, is that in addition to all of the people that came over the border or came out of Gaza and into Israel, we understand, by the way, that today there was a Hamas terrorist member who was discovered today, still inside Israeli territory. We don't know if that's the last one. One hopes that that's potentially the last one of those that infiltrated back then. But in addition to the attacks on land and those that came in flying contraptions, in paragliding, powered paragliding flying contraptions, and entering on pickup trucks and so on and so forth, and motorbikes. Should also mention that one of the ways that this was able to take place was the huge number of rockets that were fired on the first day, on October the 7th, over 2,000 rockets fired into Israeli territory on the first day of the war. Again, we'll speak more about those rockets, which Israelis have been living through, particularly those living in the south of Israel. In Hebrew, there's a word tiftuf. It means like dripping. And we'll speak more about the fact that these rocket attacks are not something new. They're something that have been taking place on a semi-regular basis. And part of the security conception has been that there is a certain amount of rocket fire which is considered acceptable. How you would feel about that where you live in your country is the idea of a government deeming a certain amount of rocket fire into a country acceptable, but this is the reality. So this was the rocket fire on the first day of the war. So we have a situation where huge numbers of terrorists have come in and committed atrocities. It takes a significant amount of time to gain control of the situation inside Israeli territory. A huge number of civilian casualties. This is something which is huge, of course, dominating the news here in Israel. We spoke about the rockets, but after the first day and a half to 2 days of the war, we start to see an Israeli response. And again, I mentioned I don't want to show huge graphic photos, but here we can see some significant damage. Again, we've also seen pictures of the dead, children, elderly, very, very, very difficult pictures from rocket fire going into Gaza since this took place. And we'll speak more about why, how, the acceptability, the non-acceptability, and so on. Depending on your sources, it's understood that between 2,500 to 4,500 people in Gaza have been killed as a result of everything that is going on between Israel and Hamas. And we'll try and again be very delicate in the wording in terms of allocating responsibility. So this is the situation in Gaza. We also understand that after all of these events took place, any food, water supplies from Israel into the Gaza Strip were immediately sealed off, meaning that Israel is not supplying water or food, fuel, and so on to the Gazans. We understand now that there is a certain amount of aid. Today, we understand that a small amount of fuel is also started to be brought into the Gaza Strip from the south, from Egypt. The IDF, I just listened shortly before the session to a statement from the IDF insisting that they are endeavoring to make sure that fuel remains in the hands of UNRWA, in the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, dealing with the plight of the Palestinians there in Gaza and not making its way through to Hamas. Again, it's very difficult with the fact that Hamas is the absolute ruler in Gaza. So this is a little bit about this. And finally, in this particular section, speak a little bit about the immediate international reaction. So here we can see President Biden, who's visited Israel. Also, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of the UK, has already visited Israel. The European Union, many of the major countries of the West have made very, very strong pronouncements of condemnation of Hamas, designated all of these places as terrorist organization, and of course, also made very strong pronouncements about freeing the hostages as well. One of the things, especially after the Israeli response inside Gaza, is we started to hear a lot of language referring to Israel has every right to defend itself, condemning Hamas, and that it's very important for Israel to act according to international law. And these ideas and the ideas of proportionality are also something that we'll speak about as well. I want to speak about how we got in this situation. First of all, I want to, again, where does one start to tell the story? And again, each and every one, depending on their side, if we can use the word sides, or their perspectives and their politics, will start the story in a different way. I'm going to start with a map just before the mandate period. This is a map of Israel/Palestine between 1516 and 1917. We can see over here, can just about make out, this is the Mediterranean Sea, can just about make out the area of Israel/Palestine over here. In this time, the area is under the control of the Ottomans, who are non-Arab Muslims, and it's a small part, really a backwater of the Ottoman, a much larger Ottoman Empire. Some parts of what at that time is Ottoman Palestine are semi or autonomously controlled, and some parts are under the direct control of Damascus. So again, you can see the various names for the places over here. Important to say that at this time, there was no Jewish state here in Palestine, and there was no Palestinian, Arab, Muslim/Arab Palestinian state in Palestine. In fact, again, going back historically, the last independent state, if we could describe it as a state, of course, things were very different in those times, going back to the Hasmonean period 2,200 years ago. After that, we're speaking about Roman, Byzantine, Umayyad, Abbasid, Fatimid, Crusader, etc., but parts of much larger empires. More connected to the modern contemporary politics is the map that we see over here. So the area that you see over here, this is Israel, Gaza, and West Bank. We don't see those delineations because back in 1917, or between 1917 and 1948, Gaza was not distinct. The West Bank was not distinct. There was no state of Israel or state of Palestine. This area was the British Mandate. In fact, more specifically, all of this area was the British Mandate, including Jordan. But within a year, this section, the section that we see here today, is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, was separated off from the rest of British Mandate Palestine. The 22% of British Mandate Palestine that remained is the area that we call Palestine today. The rest became an autonomous region and gained independence as the state of Jordan, or the country or the Kingdom of Jordan, in 1946. The rest of Palestine, again, the area that was familiar to us, we see over here. So we're looking at British Mandate Palestine, and we're now jumping forward to 1947. The map that we're looking at right now is a partition plan. Now, I'm not going to go deep into the politics, and we'll leave that for another session. You're welcome to ask me questions. We'll be on here forever and ever and ever. But what we're looking at here is a decision by the British by the summer of 1947 to renounce or relinquish their control of the area of Palestine. So after the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, different parts of the Ottoman Empire are carved up between the great powers. Syria and Lebanon have become part of the under the French Mandate, the area we see here under the British Mandate. By 1947, the British, for various reasons, decide that they no longer wish to have control over this area, and they request from the newly created United Nations to determine a solution for the area. In the summer of 1947, the United Nations send a team to British Mandate Palestine. They look at where Jews and Arabs are settled, and they present this plan. This was a two-state solution. Should also mention, by the way, in 1938, the British came up with an earlier plan called the Peel Plan, the Peel Commission and the Peel Plan. That plan actually created a much larger Arab state within Palestine and a smaller Jewish state. The Arabs at the time rejected the idea of continuing on with the plan. This is the plan that was put forward and passed by the United Nations General Assembly on November 29th, 1947. The Jews of Palestine and the Jews around the world accepted the plan. The plan said that there would be a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine. And the terminology is very important. It wasn't State of Israel and State of Palestine. It was Jewish state and Arab state in Palestine. That's not to say that there was no Palestinian Arab national consciousness in the 1930s and 1940s, but the idea of a distinct Palestinian nation in Palestine at this time was something that was, in terms of the terminologies, was still developing. The Jews didn't accept this plan because the plan was a good plan. They didn't accept this plan. The Jewish leadership in Palestine didn't accept the plan because it was everything they wanted. But the plan determined that essentially the world had voted to recognize that the Jews were a people. And that's something we'll speak about a little bit later on when we're speaking about different terminologies and about how the argument between pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian is taking place around the world. I don't really like these terms, but a lot of it is based on the decision to try and say that the other is not a people. And we'll speak more about that. The world has voted to create a nation state, recognize the Jews as a people and create a state. Wherever it is, this is in Palestine, in the historic land of Israel for the Jewish people, and the leadership accepts the plan. You can see over here, by the way, that Jerusalem is not going to be part of the Arab state, which is in yellow, or part of the Jewish state, which is in indigo or blue. Of course, to get to Jerusalem, one had to, if you were Jewish, you would need to go through the Arab state. Should also mention that by the beginning of the 20th century, there was already a Jewish majority inside Jerusalem, but practically it was surrounded, as we see until today, on the northeast and southern side by predominantly Arab areas, and that's the case also today as well. This plan never came into being. This plan was rejected by the Arab world and the Palestinian Arab leadership. Again, when we talk about Palestinian Arab leadership back in 1948, 1947, the leadership was much less galvanized, united than the Jewish leadership at the time. The Jewish leadership had been paving the way and preparing the way for the creation of a nation state. So there was the developing language and economic institutions and cultural institutions and educational institutions and so on and so forth. And they were speaking largely, not completely, in one voice. In the Arab world, there were those that were more amenable to compromise, but there were also those that were more extreme. It was the extremists that really had control at that time and rejected this plan. When the plan was rejected, a war begins. War begins as a civil war between Jews and Arabs in British Mandate Palestine. And after around 6 months, when the British depart, the Jews of Palestine declare a state. That state is to be known as the State of Israel, and the war continues on. So the war, as Jews call the War of Independence, or Israelis call the War of Independence, actually begins at the end of 1947. It becomes a national war when Israel is attacked by the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Lebanese, and also the Iraqis as well. And the war continues on for another 6 months or so. By the beginning of 1949, a series of ceasefires are signed. These ceasefires are not peace agreements, meaning that at this time, when these ceasefires are signed, the area that we know today as the sovereign state of Israel, the internationally recognized state of Israel, is the area that we see here in blue. And these are the areas that were part of the state of Israel following the ceasefires at the beginning of 1949 through to the Six-Day War in June 1967. All of the area that we see here in blue is the state of Israel. Around 14,000 square miles, 264 miles long, the size of New Jersey. It's not big, but this is the state. This is the internationally recognized state of Israel. Very importantly, notice the West Bank. Again, there are different names for this area. Some call it Judea and Samaria, the biblical names for the area. Others call it Palestine, occupied territories, so on and so forth. The West Bank is often seen as a relative, which is what I generally call it, what comes out of my mouth. It's generally considered to be a relatively neutral term, but actually it was a term that was created by the Jordanians because the Jordanians in the war of 1947 to 1949 occupied the West Bank. And the West Bank, or this area, became under Jordanian occupation. In 1950, it was officially annexed to become part of Jordan, and the West Bank was occupied and annexed by Jordan between 1949 and 1967. You'll be very excited to know that of all the countries in the world that recognize Jordanian occupation of the West Bank, Britain and Pakistan. So those are the two countries that recognized Jordanian occupation and annexation, meaning the application of Jordanian law over this area. And that was the case between 1948 and 1967. Notice the Golan Heights isn't here. It was under Syrian control. It was part of Syria. And the Gaza Strip over here is a different color to the West Bank. And that's because the Gaza Strip, which was not a separate area before the war of 47, 48, 49, but in that war, this area that had previously, remember, been part of British Mandate Palestine and not part of Egypt, came under Egyptian control. And it remained under Egyptian control until 1967. The Egyptians, however, did not annex the Gaza Strip. They simply occupied the area. They didn't apply Egyptian law. They didn't give citizenship to the Palestinian Arabs living in the Gaza Strip. And that was the case between 1948 and 1967. So this area was occupied and annexed to become part of Jordan, the West Bank. Gaza was under Egyptian occupation between 1948 and 1967. However, if we move a little bit further on, hold on. Let me just come back a moment to a map of Israel. There we go. After the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel takes control of the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, and also takes control of the West Bank, and also takes control of the Golan Heights. Later on, the Golan Heights will be annexed to become part of Israel, and that means Israeli law is applied to the Golan Heights. It's considered Israel under Israeli law. Many places in the world consider, many countries in the world consider it illegally occupied by Israel, but under Israeli law, the Golan Heights or the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights are part of Israel. The West Bank in 1967 comes under Israeli occupation and military control, and that will remain the case until the beginning of the 1990s. In the beginning of the 1990s, things change. Again, it doesn't mean that we can necessarily remove the word occupation, but things change. But up until the Oslo Accords, the West Bank was fully under Israeli military control. And that was also the case for the Gaza Strip. In both cases, neither the Gaza Strip or the West Bank were annexed to become part of Israel. So under Israeli law, these two areas are not Israel. From an international perspective, these two areas are not Israel either. And depending on your political perspective, these areas have different names and different political narratives associated with them. What I will say, and this is very important for understanding how we arrived at the situation that we're in today, is that the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are now living under Israeli control, but they are not living in the state of Israel under Israeli law. I'm going back to the period between 1967 to the beginning of the 1990s. They're not living in the state of Israel under Israeli law. They are not Israeli citizens. And that is this. And so now Israel is ruling over what was hundreds of thousands, and today are millions of Palestinian Arabs with a very different national narrative for themselves and the land than those people that at that time were ruling over. So this opens a huge Pandora's box in Israel in terms of how should Israel go about what should Israel do with these areas, and we'll speak more about that as well. Let me come back to the maps where we were before, and I want to speak a little bit about UNRWA, because this is also key to understanding what is going on today. So UNRWA is a refugee agency which is tasked with responsibility for Palestinian refugees. So if you look over here, again, I don't know if you can see, so looking over here, it's just slightly off map, but this is the Gaza Strip. The red dots that you can see are Palestinian refugee camps. The same over here in the West Bank. You can also see here in Jordan, there are also Palestinian refugee camps in Syria and in Lebanon as well. There were for a time in Egypt, I don't believe now anymore. These refugee camps, UNRWA came into creation almost immediately after the establishment of the State of Israel, and it was to deal with the Palestinian refugees. Now, I was asked a question about Palestinian refugees, so I'll try and deal with it now here as well. In the aftermath of what Palestinians call the Nakba, or the catastrophe, and what Israelis call the War of Independence, somewhere in the order of 750,000 Palestinian Arabs became refugees. Now, there are various narratives for how those people became refugees. Some of them were intimidated by the Jewish and then Israeli forces. In certain cases, there were acts of physical violence in the context of the war. And so some of them fled because of actual violence. Many of them fled because there was a war going on. And as we're seeing right now, and we're speaking about right now, what do people do when they're in a war and whether they want to stay in a place? And there were also those that left with the call of the Arab armies to move out the way in order that things will be easier, in order to destroy the nascent state of Israel. All of those narratives are true and happen in the war. And so there is certainly various levels of responsibility on both the Arab world, the Palestinian Arabs, and on Israelis, Jews for what took place in 1948. 750,000 Palestinians become refugees. Where do they go? Well, some of them go into the Gaza Strip, which is occupied by Egypt. Some of them go into Egypt. Some of them go into the West Bank, which is occupied by Jordan and then annexed to become part of Jordan. And some end up in other Arab countries. And most of them end up in what you can see here on this map, which is Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, Jordan, and the Gaza Strip. UNRWA is established to deal with the Palestinian refugees and sets up Palestinian refugee camps. Most of these refugee camps were set up 1949, 1950. At that time, of course, all of the camps were set up in areas that were not under Israeli control. They were under control of the Arab countries, or they were under control of Egypt and Jordan, in the case of both Jordan and the West Bank. And so when we speak about Palestinian refugee camps today, which are today more akin to slum cities or slum towns, these camps were set up back at the end of the 1940s and beginning of the 1950s by UNRWA within the Arab world, in areas controlled by the Arab countries. 750,000 or so Palestinian refugees. Now, there are many, again, if we're thinking about the time of Turkey and Greece or Pakistan and India, there are many, many examples of huge upheaval and transfers and swapping and people moving in terms of populations. I mentioned earlier on about Ofakim having a significant population in the south outside of Gaza of Jews that came from the Arab and North African world. Approximately 800,000 Jews came from the Arab world in the wake of the creation of the State of Israel as refugees. 800,000. In fact, today, the majority of Jews in Israel have in their lineage, more connection to the Arab world than they do to Jews who spent the last few hundred years in Europe. So this is the situation. And so we can understand these two essentially similar sized refugee populations and what happened to them. In any case, I wrote here, and you can see over here, part of the definition of who UNRWA deals with. So who is UNRWA dealing with? Because if there were 750,000 Palestinian refugees in 1948, today there are over 6 million Palestinian refugees. Now, in most places in the world, you would expect refugee populations to shrink as time goes by, and unfortunately, people pass away. However, as you can see here, UNRWA's definition of those that it supplies services to are not only refugees from the conflict in 1948, but also their male descendants. So we have a population of refugees which is growing today as more and more children are born. Now, if we're talking about national identity, one of the core tenets of Palestinian Arab national identity is this idea that the refugees lost their homes in 1948 and that they should be able to return to their homes. However, 6 million and growing population of refugees who would not be considered refugees under the definition of UNHCR, but again, UNRWA has a different definition of refugee, creates part of the political problem. On the one hand, we have a large population who still need to be dealt with. UNRWA needs to deal with these people, regardless if they're children of children and children of children of. They still need to be dealt with if they're in huge poverty. But on the other hand, if we're trying to arrive, and someone asked me about whether a two-state solution is still possible, that one of the barriers to a two-state solution is refugees. If the demand is that every person defined as a refugee by UNRWA will be able to live in Israel, this would be problematic to finding a solution. I should also mention that one of the needs of UNRWA, the reason the Palestinian refugees need UNRWA, is because until today, the vast majority of Palestinian refugees have not been given citizenship in the countries in which they live. So Palestinian refugees in the West Bank were not given citizenship by Jordan. Again, it's confusing because there were Palestinians in Gaza after 1948, or before 1948 rather, and there were Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank before 1948. If they didn't move or they stayed within the West Bank and Gaza, those Palestinians are not refugees. But those that left what became Israel, they are considered refugees. So we have different Palestinians. Some are refugees, some are not. The Palestinians in the West Bank received citizenship from Jordan, a conditional citizenship, but the refugees did not. The refugees in Gaza did not receive Egyptian citizenship, neither did the non-refugees in the case of Gaza. And until today, the Palestinians in Lebanon and Syria also are unable to receive citizenship from the countries in which they have lived many second, third, and fourth generations and are barred from many professions and work. This is the situation. Therefore, the need to continue to give support to Palestinians living in the refugee camps is very important. One of the reasons for that is because they were not supported or not given citizenship or not helped and supported by the Arab world, ultimately, which is very different from those Jewish refugees that arrived in similar or slightly larger numbers, mostly to the state of Israel after 1948. I should also mention, if we're talking about the West Bank and Gaza, and I was also asked about, well, someone asked me a question about why Gaza has often been seen to be more extreme than the West Bank. And part of that is related to the question of refugees. In Gaza, there are approximately 2.3 million Palestinians. Approximately 1.8 million of those are refugees, according to the UNRWA definition. So around 80% of Gazans are refugees. Refugees tend to be the least educated, the most impoverished, the most ignored. And if we're speaking about that national identity, or part of the conditioning of Palestinian society and the Arab world, that every single person who is a refugee should be able to live in what is now the state of Israel, something that for many would be the end of the state of Israel. If that's a significant part of the identity of 80% of those people living inside Gaza, we can understand also why in the West Bank it's the opposite ratio. Around 20% of Palestinians in the West Bank are refugees, and according to the UNRWA definition, and it makes a difference. And you'll see that even in the West Bank, most of the militancy is found within the refugee camps. It's not a coincidence. Moving on. In 1964, and I'll go a little bit faster. In 1964, the PLO was established. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was established by the Arab League in Cairo in 1964. It was established by the Arab countries. It's very important to understand because when it was established in 1964, Gaza and the West Bank, you'll remember, were still under Egyptian and Jordanian occupation and annexation. So the PLO was not specifically founded in order to deal with occupation in all areas, but specifically occupation by Israel of areas of Palestine since 1948. And again, this is very important when we're speaking and trying to understand terminology of occupation. For some, there's this idea that occupation begins in 1967 when Israel conquers the West Bank and the Gaza Strip from Jordan and Egypt. For many Palestinians, occupation begins in 1948 when Israel comes into existence. So this was the creation of the PLO. And I mentioned before the 1990s. The 1990s was very important because at the beginning of the 1990s, a peace process starts to develop, which we know today as the Oslo Accords. I won't go into it in great detail, but it has a huge impact on the way things look in the political and social landscape in Israel for Israelis and Palestinians today. As part of the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian Authority was created. The Palestinian Authority would become essentially the government of Palestine to be. The largest party in the PLO is the Fatah party. This is the party that was of Yasser Arafat, is now of Mahmoud Abbas, who's the president of the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority, government, law courts, education system, refuse collection, car licensing, everything that you can imagine. The idea was to move towards Palestinian statehood. This was the idea of the Oslo Accords, was to build Palestinian national infrastructure, preparation for statehood, and forge connections with Israel so that the huge issues of Jerusalem, borders, refugee settlements, which we'll speak about, they can be, it's very hard to deal with them when you are enemies, but if we can create the Palestinians ready for statehood and get everything ready, we were speaking about that with regard to the Jews before 1948, then surely at that point it will be much easier to sit down in a mature way and deal with the problems between Israelis and Palestinians. It didn't exactly happen that way, but one of the legacies of the Oslo Accords is the map that we see here in front of us, which divides the West Bank and Gaza into areas A, B, and C. Area A, areas under full Palestinian civil and security control. So again, when we're speaking about, we were talking before about Israeli military control, here's where things become a little bit more hazy, because places like Jenin and Tulkarem and Jericho and Bethlehem and Ramallah and Nablus and so on and so forth come under their area A, which is these darker red areas that you see here. Again, it's very much all mixed together. These come under Palestinian civil and security control. So Palestinian police force, Palestinians living full control over those areas. Area B, which is the lighter areas that you see, for example, over here. Area B are areas under Palestinian civil control, but Israeli military control. So Israel is still responsible for the security. And the rest of the areas you see in white, again, most of it you can see here along the Jordan Valley, but it also encompasses the Israeli settlements or Israeli villages that were established in the West Bank and Gaza after 1967. These are Area C, which will be under full Israeli security and civil control. In the case of Gaza, we're switching now down to Gaza. This was Gaza after Oslo. So where you can see red or pink, all of these areas were the that you can see over here, or all of the large red areas are Area A, major Palestinian population centers. what you can see over here are 21 different Israeli settlements that were in Gaza, placed in Gaza after 1967. So Gaza also had settlements in, and that was until 2005. In 2005, again, forget the yellow for a moment. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew. This was under the period of the prime ministership of Ariel Sharon. Israel unilaterally withdrew all of the settlements, 21 different settlements. All of the population of the Israeli population of those settlements was withdrawn from the Gaza Strip. So from 2005 onwards, there were no longer any Israelis living in Gaza, and the entirety of Gaza internally came under Palestinian control. On the one hand, the internal Gaza was under Palestinian control, but of course, Gaza still has a border with Egypt, which was largely closed, and a border with Israel, which you can see over here. After 2005, the border with Israel remained open in as much as it was controlled, but there were many people coming back and forth. There was a lot of people going in. There was a lot of things going in and out. Nonetheless, ultimately, you have this idea of whether today we have the idea of the terminology that is Gaza is the world's largest open-air prison, or that Gaza has been occupied since 2005. One of the reasons for this argument is because despite the fact that Israel withdrew completely from the Gaza Strip, it remained ultimately able to control the airspace, waters, and to see what was going in and out. But Gaza, after the withdrawal in 2005, was not blockaded, and all of the infrastructure of the Israeli settlements, the factories, the agriculture, the houses, were all left intact inside Gaza in 2005. What happened after 2005 completely dictates, in many ways, where we are found today. After 2005, or a year after, remember that there was no blockade on Gaza after 2005. The area, broadly speaking, came under the auspices of the Palestinian Authority. But in 2006, there were Palestinian elections. It was the first time, and actually it was the only time, there haven't yet been further elections. And in those elections, in the Palestinian Legislative Council, the Hamas, which we are going to speak about more, the Hamas, which again, on the one hand, we think of them today, many of us, maybe not all, as a terrorist organization, but we're going to understand how Hamas came into being and understand that Hamas transitioned into politics at this stage, but prior to that, it was largely a religious and social welfare organization with a military wing. In 2006, despite the fact that Hamas had committed suicide bombings and was very much seen as a terrorist organization, certainly by Israel and many around the world, Hamas won the elections in 2006. Much of the international community refused to deal directly with Hamas because of their perception as a terrorist organization. The same was true of Israel as well. And in 2007, there was a coup in Gaza, and the Hamas took complete control. The Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority, the Fatah refused to accept the legitimacy of the elections. There was infighting between the different political factions within the Palestinian society. And in 2007, the Hamas, in a bloody coup, murdered much of the political opposition. And since 2007, the West Bank and Gaza have been essentially operating as two separate entities. The West Bank continues to be controlled by the Palestinian Authority and dominated by the Fatah party of Abu Mazen, of Mahmoud Abbas, the president, and Gaza has been exclusively, autocratically, dictatorially ruled by Hamas since 2007. And it's since 2007, with exclusive control of the Gaza by the Hamas and the acceleration of rocket fire and terrorist activity, that Israel placed a blockade on Gaza. So if you will speak about whether Israel has a blockade on Gaza, the answer is yes. Israel had a blockade on Gaza. That blockade began in 2007 when the Hamas seized exclusive control of Gaza, not 2005 when the Israeli settlements were removed from Gaza. Let me speak a little bit about Hamas. Some of you asked me questions about how Hamas were formed. Speaking about, was Israel involved in Hamas's involvement was one of the questions I was asked, and also about Israel's policy, whether Israel has helped to strengthen Hamas. I'll try and allude to all of this as well. I want to take you back to 1987. In 1987, there was what Palestinians call the first throwing off, or the first intifada. It was a spontaneous uprising, which began in Gaza towards the end of 1987. It was a huge popular uprising, and many Israelis were shocked by the fervency of the uprising across Palestinian society. And it was much of this shock that caused Israel, on the one hand, to be open to the idea of participating and moving towards the creation of a peace process, the Oslo Accords. Following the uprising, there were those within Gaza who were affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is an extreme Islamist organization which began in Egypt in the 1920s. And the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza reached out to the Israeli military government at the time, members of, and suggested that the Israeli, remember at the time Gaza was under Israeli military occupation back at the end of the 1980s, and suggested that Israel could help and support those people in creating after-school classes, healthcare, religious instruction, and so on and so forth, in order to help guide and take Palestinian young people off the streets and so on and so forth. Now, at the time, those people in the political echelons understood ultimately that there was the radical ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is what we're seeing today in many ways through the Hamas. But at the time, they understood that it was politically expedient and that those people at that time could be helpful in providing help and support, or helping Israel's aims of reducing tension and potentially being a counterweight to the politics of the PLO, the Fatah and the PLO, who were still the major enemy of Israel back in the end of the 1980s. And so a series of youth clubs and health clinics grew. So when we speak about whether Israel was involved in creating Hamas, it's a slight misnomer. It is true that Israel helped supported those that would become Hamas to create the infrastructure that they would then use to inculcate their ideology to young people across Gaza and the West Bank. But that's not why Israel did it. Ultimately, Israel unwittingly was part of a process that would go on to create the Hamas. And that was the situation. So Hamas began as a civil and religious organization. And for many, many years, Hamas was seen as the opposite of, especially during the Oslo Accords, when the Fatah, the PLO, was seen by many Palestinians as, by virtue of being prepared to negotiate with Israel, traitors, or they were seen as corrupt. And that's very much the case in Palestinian society today, that many Palestinians, millions of Palestinians today, believe that the Palestinian Authority doesn't exist for the good of the Palestinians, but exists for the good of those in the Palestinian Authority, in the leadership. And Hamas was seen as a pure alternative. It was motivated by religious values. It was providing healthcare and education and religious instruction. It was building mosques and so on and so forth. And this is how Hamas really increased its power base and became very, very strong. Towards the end of the 1980s, Hamas also transitioned into the terrorism that we know of today. A little bit about the Hamas. I'm just going to move a little bit to the side, because one of the questions I was asked was about that Hamas has been compared, whether, again, there was a question to me about BBC and certain news outlets, whether they're prepared to call Hamas terrorists. That was a question that I was asked. I was also asked questions about the similarity between the Islamic State and Hamas, and there are similarities and there are differences. Again, and one can refer to the tactics that we saw, which are very, very much evocative of tactics of Islamic State, perhaps at times even worse. But I also wanted to show you this is from the Hamas Charter, just to give you some kind of idea of the ideological underpinning. So I won't read all of it. You can read over parts of it yourself. But I'll just move to the side. Say Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. The second paragraph is a passage from the sayings of what's believed to be the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, speaking about that when the judgment day will come, that the trees will tell the followers of Allah, the followers of God, where Jews are hiding in order that they can be killed. So you can look and understand. I'll also, again, speaking about jihad, but also the passage over here is very interesting because it speaks about waqf. Waqf is an Islamic concept of land or property ownership or land ownership. The idea behind waqf essentially is that if something is essentially under Islamic control, therefore belongs to the Islamic Ummah or nation. There's an idea that once an area has been under Islamic control, a very extreme interpretation, it can only ever be under Islamic control. So you can see over here, for example, the Islamic resistance believes that the land of Palestine is an Islamic waqf consecrated for future Muslim generations until Judgment Day. This is the law governing the land of Palestine, and the same goes for any land that Muslims have conquered by force. So for those of you around the world who perhaps live in countries that have at a certain point been under Islamic control, so according to this strict Islamist interpretation, those areas cannot be under anything but Islamic control. They are waqf. So just to understand the more global nature of the ideal of this Islamist, not Islam, but this Islamist, political Islamist ideology. So again, all of these are really explaining and telling us what we're seeing and hearing right now. And again, you can see over here, very important, I'll just finish on this last one. It very much speaks about initiatives and peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. And again, many Muslims today disavow the idea of violent jihad. Jihad is about personal struggle. It's about self-improvement. It's about spreading understanding of Islam through peace. In this case, jihad very much means violent jihad. And you can see it all here, just in front. And just for a moment, I want to show you a video that gives you a little bit interesting understanding. So let me share screen.
Listen, I understand that it's your job to ask questions, but I think the choice of questions really has importance here. And I understand that civilians who are there are afraid and concerned. But look, on the other side, we evacuated all of the Israeli citizens in southern Israel. The places are empty. It's ghost towns. All of the communities around the Gaza border, they're empty. Either killed, butchered, or wounded by Hamas, or taken hostage, or actively evacuated by the IDF. And they're all over Israel now, in hotels or with family or wherever they have found a place to be. Why? Because we don't want civilians in an active combat zone. That's also what we've told the Palestinians. It's an active combat zone. Get out.
But, you know, our humanity has to go in a lot of directions, and there are innocent people in Gaza. You say this yourself, that they are not your enemies, right?
Yes, exactly. Humanity should go two directions, and our humanity is the fact that we are telling them, go to the stay clear of Gaza City because we're going to operate there. That is an actual expression of our humanity, which is in such sharp contrast to the lack of humanity of our enemies. Not only do they target our civilians, but they use their civilians in order to protect themselves. Hamas uses Gazan civilians in order to protect themselves. And I think it is despicable. That should be the front and center of the entire conversation about what's going on here. Yes, there's always two sides to a story, but one side has been attacked, has suffered 1,300 casualties and didn't want this war. And the other side knowingly went into our cities and butchered our civilians. And they continue to fire rockets and they continue to hold our hostages, men, women, children, and elderly. So there is no moral parity between us and Hamas. But listen, we are at war. We cannot be expected to forfeit our ability to defend ourselves just because a terrorist organization has rigged the entire Gaza Strip to serve its military goals. We have to totally, fundamentally change the situation in Gaza, and we have to rid our southern border of this cancerous threat that Hamas is.
So just as a final question to you, would the IDF facilitate a humanitarian corridor into Egypt to help foreign nationals get out of this area?
I'll do you one better. What Hamas should do is to stop fighting, return our hostages, surrender unconditionally, and Yahya Sinwar and all of his other commanders and political leaders of Hamas should surrender without condition. That would be the best humanitarian step anybody could take in Gaza, and it would save countless lives.
عملية من هذا النوع تقوم بها حماس، هذه ليست عملية عادية، هذه بمثابة إعلان حرب، وبالتالي البعض يقول كيف كانت حساباتكم لردود الفعل الإسرائيلية؟ نحن نشاهد ما يحدث في قطاع غزة من مأساة إنسانية كبيرة صح عليها سكان غزة، لا تمت استشارة الفصائل ولا استشارة السلطة ولا استشارة سكان غزة، أنتم اتخذتم القرار وحدكم.
هذه اللحظة العبقرية التي استطاعت كتائب القسام أن تفاجئ بها العدو وكل استخبارات العالم، هذا كان ينبغي أن يكون في إطار ضيق، لكن نحن هنا لم نبتدع مقاومة جديدة، نحن في جو المقاومة، فحين تقوم بخطوة هو في سياق مقاومة مشروعة شعبنا
متفق عليها. أنت تتحدث في نقاط مهمة، تقول أن هذه مقاومة مشروعة من وجهة نظركم، ولكن ما شاهده العالم على شاشات التلفاز في العالم الغربي كان انتهاكات من حركة حماس ضد المدنيين الإسرائيليين، حتى أن الحركة وأنت مسؤول عن صورة الحركة في الخارج أصبحت تقرن بداعش.
هذه تهمة طبعا افتراها نتنياهو، هذا والغرب للأسف متواطئ. الشعوب يا أختي العزيزة لا تتحرر بسهولة. الروس قدموا 30 مليون ضحية في الحرب العالمية الثانية حتى يتحرروا من هجوم هتلر عليهم. الشعب الفيتنامي قدم 3 مليون ونصف بني آدم حتى هزموا الأمريكان. أفغانستان هزمت الاتحاد السوفيتي أولا، ثم أمريكا بملايين من الشهداء. الشعب الجزائري 6 ملايين شهيد عبر 130 عاما. الشعب الفلسطيني مثل كل شعوب، ما في شعب يتحرر بدون تضحيات.
كيف تطالب الغرب والعالم بأن يناصر القضية الفلسطينية، وما يتصدر المشهد الآن هي الممارسات التي ارتكبتها حماس باتجاه المدنيين الإسرائيليين؟ سيد خالد، أنت تعلم أن هناك تعاطف كبير اكتسبته إسرائيل من هذه المشاهد. هل في فكر وعقيدة حماس التعامل هكذا مع المدنيين؟
أنا قلت لك يا أختي العزيزة، حماس وكتائب القسام والأجنحة العسكرية تركز مقاومتها على قوات الاحتلال، على الجنود، لكن في كل الحروب يسقط بعض الضحايا من المدنيين، لسنا مسؤولين عنهم.
الناس في لبنان تعيش وضعا سيئا، ليست في حاجة إلى حرب جديدة تكلفها المزيد من الفواتير. يقولون لك خالد مشعل يجلس في المكيف ويتحدث عن الحروب وعن الجهاد وعن الخروج وعن القصف.
نحن في قلب المعركة يا أختي الكريمة، ما حد جالس في الميدان ولا حد برا الميدان، قيادة حماس في الداخل والخارج تخوض المعركة.
هل قامت إيران حتى اللحظة بما كنتم تتوقعون منها؟ هي كانت تتحدث في مراحل سابقة عن إزالة إسرائيل.
وظيفتنا أن نطلب وأن نذكر، أما كل واحد يتحمل قراره.
أن ساعة الصفر كانت سرية للغاية. عدد محدود من قيادة حماس يعرف أقل من أصابع اليد الذين كانوا يعرفون عن العملية وتوقيتها. وحماس سلوكها في السنتين الماضيات انه عقلاني وما بتدخل في حروب وما وقفت مع الجهاد الاسلامي في معركته السابقه،
لكن هي كانت ضمن استراتيجيه
طبعا انه حماس مشغوله بالحكومه في غزه وبدها تدير بالها على 1.5 مليون فلسطيني وملتهيه وخلص تركت المقاومه. لكن حماس من تحت الطاوله كانت تحضر لهذه العمليه الكبيره، وصواريخ المقاومه اليوم بتغطي كل فلسطين. وين بده ياخذهم؟ على تل ابيب؟ ما احنا من اليوم الاول قصفنا تل ابيب. بده ياخذهم على الجليل؟ الجبهه الشماليه انفتحت اليوم مع لبنان، يعني ليست آمن الجليل الان للعدو الصهيوني، ونحن قادرون ان نقصف الجليل من فلسطين المحتله. لسريه المعركه ولنجاح ساعه الصفر ما كان حد يعرف من الفصائل وحتى الحلفاء ما كانوا يعرفوا ساعة السفر. لكن بعد نصف ساعة جرى اتصال مع كافة فصائل المقاومة الفلسطينية ومع حلفائنا في حزب الله في إيران، تم تبليغهم الأتراك، تم تبليغهم، يعني صار لقاء معهم بعد 3 ساعات، يعني 9 صباحا. وكذلك كل من اتصل بنا وضعناه بالصورة، حتى الروس أرسلوا رسالة واستفسروا، كذلك تم وضعهم بالموقف وبأهداف المعركة.
في معتقلين فلسطينيين أيضا خارج إسرائيل في دول أوروبية، يمكن
في معتقلين في أمريكا
كمان
بدنا إياهم طبعا. في عندنا من حماس معتقلين في أمريكا ومحكومين مؤبدات، كمان بدنا إياهم طبعا. نطالب أمريكا أن تفرج عن أبنائنا اللي في سجونها. وأمريكا عم بتعمل تبادل، عملت مع إيران قبل مدة قريبة تبادل، ليش ما تعمل معنا تبادل؟ ما هي شريكي في هذه المعركة. أعلن بايدن، أعلى سلطة في أمريكا، أعلن وقوفه مع إسرائيل ضد حماس، ضد الشعب الفلسطيني. لذلك هو شريك في العدوان، عليه أيضا أن يدفع الثمن. الإسرائيلي معروف عنه أنه بحب الحياة. إحنا بنضحي، نعتبر أنه قتلانا شهداء. فأمنا يعني أهم أمنية عند أي واحد فلسطيني أنه يستشهد في سبيل الله، يعني دفاعا عن أرضه. ومحضرين حالنا، إلنا 2 سنين عم نحضر ومنرتب، وصنعنا كتير، وعندنا مصانع كل شيء. عندنا من صواريخ 250 كيلو ل 160 كيلو ل 80 كيلو ل 45 كيلو ل 10 كيلو. عندنا مصانع هاونات وقذائفها، مصانع بسفن وقذائفها، مصانع بيتن وقذائفها، مصانع كلاشينكوف ورصاصته، رصاصة كلاشينكوف عم نصنعها بالإذن من الروس، عم نصنعها في غزة. صرنا حلفائنا اليوم، احنا اللي بدعمنا بالمال والسلاح بشكل رئيسي إيران، بتعطينا مال وسلاح، هذا أكيد. حزب الله، في عنا شعوب عربية وإسلامية واقفة معنا، في عنا دول تؤيدنا بالموقف السياسي. حتى الروسي اليوم متعاطف معنا، حتى الروسي يعني أرسل رسائل صباح أمس في تعاطف، ويعني سعيد أن تربك أمريكا في فلسطين. تعرف بتخفف عنه الضغط في أوكرانيا، لأنه معركة بتخفف عن معركة. فلذلك إحنا لسنا وحدنا في الميدان.
I want to speak a little bit again about, and again with that in mind, that one of the questions that I was asked was about why didn't Israel see this coming? And another question I was asked is, did in some way the policy of Netanyahu and his government over the last few years contribute to what took place here? And again, these are very controversial questions within Israeli society. What I can say is, first of all, I mentioned earlier on about the idea that a certain number of rockets, to an extent, were considered acceptable. And as bizarre or as inappropriate as that might sound, the idea that your government is prepared to allow rockets to fall, that ultimately, as we're seeing right now, the cost of going into Gaza, and Israel has not yet made any land incursion into Gaza, although it appears that that will be the case, the cost is so huge in terms of the impact on the world, in terms of the loss of civilian life of Palestinians and of Israelis and of soldiers that will go in a ground incursion, that essentially the government made a decision, rightly or wrongly, that it would keep things on a low flame, that things were bad, but they were livable with. Now, of course, there are many people in Israel, especially those living in the south, that have between 7 and 9 seconds to get to a bomb shelter, which is almost impossible. When a siren would sound all the way through the years, would argue that that's unacceptable. But this was the conception. That conception was broken in this attack. And Israel had created a huge barrier to stop people getting through. Israeli military had created an underground barrier to stop tunneling taking place from underneath. Everything seemingly was prepared for the conception that the rockets could be dealt with. But what happened on October the 7th was something that was way beyond the rockets. So this idea of whether Netanyahu was responsible, this is one of the things, and I think all of this is going to be coming up a lot more, I think, in Israel. Right now, a lot of people are putting aside the blame, even if they're thinking it, because it's all focusing on the war right now and the trauma of what's taken place. But these questions will come up, whether the decision to play this game to an extent was the correct decision. It's a very good question. Yes, so this was the question that I was asked. In any case, I want to move on, and I want to speak a little bit also about, some of you may have noticed that the name of the operation that the Hamas gave was the Gaza flood, was the Al-Aqsa flood. Al-Aqsa is the name in Arabic. It's from Surah 17, verse 9, verse 1 rather, of the Quran. And it states that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, took a flight from the sacred mosque to the furthest mosque, whose precincts we did bless. And the understanding of this verse by many Muslims is that Al-Aqsa, or the furthest, the mosque, is right over here. The Dome of the Rock that you see was built in 691 AD by Abd al-Malik. The night flight of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, according to the Quran, took place at the end of the year 620. Later on, this structure that we see here commemorates this event, but this whole structure here is known by Muslims as Al-Aqsa, or Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. For Jews, the same place is the Temple Mount. Jews believe that in this very same place is where the world was created from, where Isaac went to sacrifice Isaac, and where the Jewish temple stood and God's divine presence is. So we have very contentious, competing claims, or complementary claims, depending on your perspective, on exactly the same place. And so the use of the term Al-Aqsa very much is the idea, and as we heard before, trying to bring the Muslim world behind Hamas, is connected to this idea that they're fighting very much for Islam and for the Islamic Waqf and the control of the Islamic holy sites. A little bit later on, if we have time, you're welcome to disappear, but obviously there's a lot to get through, a lot of questions that you asked me. One of the things that has been happening over the last few years in Israel is that, especially with the most recent government particularly, is that we have seen a shift to the right politically, very much also influenced religiously. And after 1967, when Israel conquered this area from the Jordanians, who themselves had occupied and annexed it earlier on, when Israel came into control of this area, it essentially continued the status quo. The Islamic Waqf organization, which had control of the area, continued to do so under the auspices of the Jordanian monarchy, even after Israel comes into control of this area, and even though this area today is considered Israel under Israeli law. This area can, again, according to the status quo, only Muslims are allowed to pray in this area. Muslims are able to have unfettered access. Jews are not allowed to pray, are only allowed to enter at certain times which don't interfere with Islamic prayer time. There have been tensions over the last couple of years or so when there have been people inside Israeli society, and those people also represented in our previous, before the war government, so to speak, or strictly speaking inside the government, that have been speaking more openly and creating more acceptability to the idea of changing this status quo. And again, it's very, very controversial, because on the one hand, actually, if you're looking for a place in Israel where there is not religious freedom or not freedom of religion, it's actually here for Jews, because this is a place where Jews that believe that it's the holiest place in the world for them are not allowed to pray. The Supreme Court of Israel ruled that this freedom of religion can be overruled because of the potential violence that could take place by Jews praying there. Nonetheless, you can understand this powder keg, and even using the term Al-Aqsa immediately evokes many things for many people across the world. I'm going to move forward, and again, talking more about, again, we'll leave aside the intelligence failures, and maybe we'll speak about that a little bit earlier on, a little bit later on. But again, we're speaking about Netanyahu. We're speaking about that the last government is not only moving to the right religiously, but also has moved to the right politically, and is seeking to make significant changes to the power of the judiciary. I won't go into it hugely now, but there were those in Israel that felt that the judiciary was overreaching into the government sphere, and that wasn't democratic. And there were many people like those demonstrating here who believed that by making the judiciary weaker, it was removing the overrides or the checks and balances that could stop the politicians and the government. And to stop the government being able to enact what it was elected to do. So this was the debate. For anyone who's been following on with this a little bit will know that Israeli society, until October the 7th, Israeli society, I can tell you, I don't remember Israeli society feeling so polarized and so angry at each other and so divisive. And we have gone through times of the Oslo Accords and debate over that, or the disengagement from Gaza and ripping Israelis out of their homes in 2005. This was, without doubt, one of the most politically and socially fraught periods in Israel's history. And again, the issues in the West Bank with settlements, which we'll speak about, the religious divides, even the Hamas have spoken openly about the fact that this gives an impression of Israeli weakness. And so there's a very strong idea, it was one of the questions I was asked, that this certainly perhaps contributed to the emboldening of the Hamas. Didn't contribute to their wish to do this. It was always known in the security apparatus that if Hamas could do what they did, they would, and worse. But in this case, perhaps they were emboldened to do so. I want to speak about tactics and what is the plan from now. And I want to go a little bit into the plan of where do we get, like, what's actually going on right now. This is the Gaza Strip once more. Some of you have been following along with the news know that Israel has stated that its plan is to utterly and completely remove Hamas from Gaza. And I would argue also from the West Bank as well, and we'll speak about that. Essentially to change the paradigm, that from being a place, an area of land with a Hamas dictatorship, that Hamas and their partners in the Islamic Jihad will be completely removed from control of the Gaza Strip, and a new security and political paradigm will exist that will provide security for all of the Israelis in Israel and living adjacent to the Gaza Strip. In order to do that, it's very, very difficult. Why? Because we have around 2.3 million people living in this very small piece of land. If I move on very slightly, you can see these are the areas of major population concentrations, just to give you some kind of idea of how concentrated the Palestinians in Gaza are living in areas. And remember, we were speaking before about 150 to 160 square miles in this area. And according to the Hamas themselves, they have somewhere in the order of 500 kilometers of tunnels underneath Gaza. 500 kilometers of tunnels in an area that's not very big. We can understand that there is almost no area of Gaza where there are no tunnels. So when we're speaking about, and then you've heard this conception of human shields, but essentially the population of Gaza lives on top, and for the most part, the people of Hamas, the tens of thousands of people of whom the Hamas are their infrastructure, much of their infrastructure, much of their weapons, and their ability, if you're going to fight, if you're going to remove them, to find them, you need to go underground. And so in order to be able to do that, again, what Israel's military is stating that its policy is right now, is essentially to remove as much infrastructure that can be reached from ground in order that everything will be underground, in order for Israeli soldiers to be able to go in order to limit the loss of civilian life. This is the claims of the Israeli military, is to move the Palestinians of Gaza, for the Palestinians of Gaza to move beyond. There's a riverbed here called Wadi Gaza, and so to move everyone into this area. And the idea is that if, and it's a big if, there will be no Palestinian civilians in this area over here, then it will mean that when the Israeli soldiers, Israeli military will go into this top section of Gaza in order to deal with the Hamas, there will not be anyone in this area, according to this utopian idea that all the civilians will go down to the south, that no civilians will be affected and less Israeli soldiers will be killed because they won't need to be taking account of Palestinian civilians. Let me show you briefly a video of the spokesperson from the Israeli military, and you can see what he's talking about from an Israeli perspective.
Listen, I understand that it's your job to ask questions, but I think the choice of questions really has importance here. And I understand that civilians who are there are afraid and concerned. But look, on the other side, we evacuated all of the Israeli citizens in southern Israel. The places are empty. It's ghost towns. All of the communities around the Gaza border, they're empty, either killed, butchered, or wounded by Hamas, or taken hostage, or actively evacuated by the IDF. And they're all over Israel now, in hotels or with family or wherever they have found a place to be. Why? Because we don't want civilians in an active combat zone. That's also what we've told the Palestinians. It's an active combat zone. Get out.
But you know, our humanity has to go in a lot of directions, and there are innocent people in Gaza. You say this yourself, that they are not your enemies, right?
Yes, exactly. Humanity should go two directions, and our humanity is the fact that we are telling them, stay clear of Gaza City because we're going to operate there. That is an actual expression of our humanity, which is in such sharp contrast to the lack of humanity of our enemies. Not only do they target our civilians, but they use their civilians in order to protect themselves. Hamas uses Gazan civilians in order to protect themselves. And I think it is despicable. That should be the front and center of the entire conversation about what's going on here. Yes, there's always two sides to a story, but one side has been attacked, has suffered 1,300 casualties and didn't want this war. And the other side knowingly went into our cities and butchered our civilians. And they continue to fire rockets, and they continue to hold our hostages. Men, women, children, and elderly. So there is no moral parity between us and Hamas. But listen, we are at war. We cannot be expected to forfeit our ability to defend ourselves just because a terrorist organization has rigged the entire Gaza Strip to serve its military goals. We have to totally, fundamentally change the situation in Gaza, and we have to rid our southern border of this cancerous threat that Hamas is.
So just as a final question to you, would the IDF facilitate a humanitarian corridor into Egypt to help foreign nationals get out of this area?
I'll do you one better. What Hamas should do is to stop fighting, return our hostages, surrender unconditionally, and Yahya Sinwar and all of his other commanders and political leaders of Hamas should surrender without condition. That would be the best humanitarian step anybody could take in Gaza, and it would save countless lives.
So this is the Israeli spokesperson, of course, putting the Israeli perspective out, but it really does feed into the debate and the discussion, because on the one hand you have the Israeli military, which is saying that it is asking Palestinians to move in order that there will not be Palestinian civilian casualties. And again, he was making the equivalence of the fact that Israel has moved hundreds of thousands of its own civilians out of areas in the north and around Gaza in order to limit civilian casualties. And so, of course, the argument is that the Hamas are having political capital, or they're using essentially the Palestinian people for their own political and military ends, on the one hand. Also, and other parts of him speaks about messages that are sent to the Palestinians, letting them know, social media, and so on and so forth. The flip side of this, of course, and we'll speak more about it for those that are with me towards the end, is about the reaction around the world. Because one of the claims is ultimately, if we're talking about between 2,500 to 4,500 Palestinians that have died during this time, which is in absolute terms, more people have died than on the Israeli side during this conflict. The idea of whether somehow numbers need to be equal, whether there is some need for proportionality, but what makes things, is the number of dead proportional, is how they're killed proportional, is intention connected? It's a big question. So one of the claims of Israel is that Israel is deliberately targeting Palestinians, that it's murdering significant numbers of Palestinians. Israel's argument is that it's actually doing completely the opposite, but sadly, that there is civilian death comes as a result, not only of war, but also because of the fact that Hamas are fighting from within the areas, and Israel claims preventing Palestinians from leaving those areas as well. It's incredibly complicated. I want to show you, just before we move on, one more video, which is fascinating, which is actually an interview with Khalid Mashal. Anyone knows a little bit, has followed along with Hamas. Khalid Mashal was the head of Hamas from the middle of the 1990s through to 2017. And he was interviewed on Al Arabiya by an incredibly brave journalist, and he was interviewed a few days after the beginning of the war. I'm going to share this with you now. Well worth watching.
عملية من هذا النوع تقوم بها حماس، هذه ليست عملية عادية، هذه بمثابة إعلان حرب، وبالتالي البعض يقول كيف كانت حساباتكم لردود الفعل الإسرائيلية؟ نحن نشاهد ما يحدث في قطاع غزة من مأساة إنسانية كبيرة صح عليها سكان غزة، لا تمت استشارة الفصائل ولا استشارة السلطة ولا استشارة سكان غزة، أنتم اتخذتم القرار وحدكم.
هذه اللحظة العبقرية التي استطاعت كتائب القسام أن تفاجئ بها العدو وكل استخبارات العالم، هذا كان ينبغي أن يكون في إطار ضيق، لكن نحن هنا لم نبتدع مقاومة جديدة، نحن في جو المقاومة، فحين تقوم بخطوة هو في سياق مقاومة مشروعة شعبنا متفق عليها.
أنت تتحدث في نقاط مهمة، تقول أن هذه مقاومة مشروعة من وجهة نظركم، ولكن ما شاهده العالم على شاشات التلفاز في العالم الغربي كان انتهاكات من حركة حماس ضد المدنيين الإسرائيليين، حتى أن الحركة، وأنت مسؤول عن صورة الحركة في الخارج، أصبحت تقرن بداعش.
هذه تهمة طبعا افتراها نتنياهو، هذا والغرب للأسف متواطئ. الشعوب يا أختي العزيزة لا تتحرر بسهولة. الروس قدموا 30 مليون ضحية في الحرب العالمية الثانية حتى يتحرروا من هجوم هتلر عليهم. الشعب الفيتنامي قدم 3 مليون ونصف بني آدم حتى هزموا الأمريكان. أفغانستان هزمت الاتحاد السوفيتي أولا، ثم أمريكا بملايين من الشهداء. الشعب الجزائري 6 ملايين شهيد عبر 130 عاما. الشعب الفلسطيني مثل كل شعوب، ما في شعب يتحرر بدون تضحيات.
كيف تطالب الغرب والعالم بأن يناصر القضية الفلسطينية، وما يتصدر المشهد الآن هي الممارسات التي ارتكبتها حماس باتجاه المدنيين الإسرائيليين؟ سيد خالد، أنت تعلم أن هناك تعاطف كبير اكتسبته إسرائيل من هذه المشاهد. هل في فكر وعقيدة حماس التعامل هكذا مع المدنيين؟
أنا قلت لك يا أختي العزيزة، حماس وكتائب القسام والأجنحة العسكرية تركز مقاومتها على قوات الاحتلال، على الجنود، لكن في كل الحروب يسقط بعض الضحايا من المدنيين، لسنا مسؤولين عنهم.
الناس في لبنان تعيش وضعا سيئا، ليست في حاجة إلى حرب جديدة تكلفها المزيد من الفواتير. يقولون لك خالد مشعل يجلس في المكيف ويتحدث عن الحروب وعن الجهاد وعن الخروج وعن القصف.
نحن في قلب المعركة يا أختي الكريمة، ما حد جالس في الميدان ولا حد برا الميدان، قيادة حماس في الداخل والخارج تخوض المعركة.
هل قامت إيران حتى اللحظة بما كنتم تتوقعون منها؟ هي كانت تتحدث في مراحل سابقة عن إزالة إسرائيل.
وظيفتنا أن نطلب وأن نذكر، أما كل واحد يتحمل قراره.
So we're hearing here directly from Khalid Mashal on the position of the Hamas, and it also leads us into, I think, a very important part. We're moving towards the end of the presentation, a little bit about going beyond Gaza, because so far we've focused on Israel and Gaza, Israel and the Hamas, and the innocent people on both sides affected by what is going on. And I wanted to move on a little bit more and go a little bit up to the north of Israel. So we've been focused down here in Gaza. We spoke briefly about the West Bank and we'll come back. But I want to come back up to the border area over here. So you can see the border between Israel, the international border between Israel and Lebanon. Lebanon is a very complicated place that we could spend hours speaking about, and you'll probably curse me for speaking too much about. But ultimately, Lebanon is a very country with a very complicated political and religious makeup, mixture of Maronite Christians, Aramaic Christians, Druze, Shiite Muslim, Sunni Muslim, and other minority groups as well. And ultimately, if you remember, Lebanon was part of the French Mandate. The Lebanese political system was created in a way that gave roles to different groups within the communities. So, for example, the president of Lebanon is always a Christian. The speaker of the prime minister will always be a Sunni Muslim. The speaker of parliament will always be Shia. The idea was that by giving a place to express or for each of the communities, that this was a way of keeping ethnic and tribal and religious differences and tensions down. This massively started to change in the 1970s. One of the reasons for the huge change in the 1970s is actually related to the Palestinians, because after 1967, when Israel conquered the West Bank from the Jordanians, the Palestinian leadership, the PLO, moved into Jordan. And in 1970, after feeling that the Palestinian leadership was threatening his position as King of Jordan, the King of Jordan led his army to push the Palestinian leadership out of Jordan and into Lebanon, which also played a role in destabilizing the different groupings within. And this, together with all kinds of tensions related to Syria next door, saw Lebanon descend into civil war. After the civil war, as Lebanon descended into civil war, the Palestinians were attacked. The Palestinian PLO in Lebanon were attacking Israel from the north. And in 1982, Israel sent forces into Lebanon in order to quash the PLO. Again, this was very controversial because Israeli forces were sent into another sovereign country. Of course, the statement was it's not against Lebanon, it's war on the PLO. Nonetheless, it was very controversial also inside Israel. And after the PLO their abilities to operate were extinguished, they fled to Tunisia. And from there, they came back at the beginning of the 1990s to the West Bank and Gaza with the Oslo Accords. After Israel kept a small buffer of land inside Lebanon with Israeli soldiers to stop terrorist attacks from Lebanon across the northern border. With all of this taking shape, a new organization sprung up called Hezbollah. Hezbollah, or Hezbollah, the Party of God, is a Shiite Islamic organization whose stated aim was to push Israel out of Lebanon. After the year 2000, Israel left Lebanon. However, I won't even show you here, but there's a small part, this area over here, Sheba Farms area over here, which Israel and Syria see as part of a dispute between Israel and Syria, and Hezbollah claim it's actually land that should belong to Lebanon. And this is the pretext for the idea that Israel hasn't fully removed itself from Lebanon. Today, it's not really necessarily relevant, but Hezbollah today is the largest military power, and it's not a state in the Arab world. It has more rockets than the whole of NATO if you take the United States out of NATO. So it's an incredibly huge power. So when you're hearing over the last couple of weeks, for example, Thursday, there were 34 rockets. Today, there have been skirmishes and deaths. That this is the next front up in the north of Israel. And again, when we were hearing the videos before of Baraka and of Khalid Mashal from the Hamas, and they were speaking about encouraging and hoping that more of the Muslim world will get involved. This is what they are speaking about, for whether the war will open up on two fronts. Israel, in the meantime, has evacuated over 40 communities along the northern border. The largest is Kiryat Shmona, which is about over here, which is quite it's a decent-sized city. It's about 100,000 residents of the north have been evacuated from the northern border, partly as a result of the rocket fire that's been coming across from Hezbollah and small amounts of Hamas terrorists who are also found in Lebanon, but also because of the potential enlarging of this front and descent into full-scale war. I can say on a very personal level, of course, I hope there will not be full-scale war. And what in the interview, I cut it out because it was too long, but part of the previous interview, the interviewer asked Khalid Mashal about Hezbollah and about whether it was appropriate to drag Lebanon in its current economic and social state, essentially to drag it into a war that it doesn't necessarily want by virtue of Hezbollah involvement. And speaking of Hezbollah, and I'll try and rush through a little bit quicker, this is a map of, again, a map of the Arab world, but the map that you see over here is a map which demonstrates balance of power and politics. Because so far we've been speaking about Israel and Hamas. We've been speaking about Israel in the area of Gaza. Now suddenly we're speaking about Hezbollah in the north. But actually, what's going on here, many people believe, and I would certainly ascribe to this point of view, is something an awful lot bigger. You saw Khaled Mashal and Baraka refer, for example, to the potential idea that Russia is amenable to a conflict taking place somewhere else in order to distract attention from Russia and Ukraine. You also start to understand on the map that we see over here, the areas that you see in red are either majority Sunni Muslim countries, or in the case of Israel, which you also see here in red, largely aligned in terms of a Saudi Arabian bloc, perhaps one would say. Israel and Saudi Arabia don't have a peace agreement. In fact, we understand quite openly that one of the reasons Hamas have spoken about launching this attack has been to try and stop the continuation of the development towards normalization or peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But the countries that you see in red are majority Sunni. Okay, the Sunni and Shia are two different groups within Islam. Traditionally, the Sunni are much greater size. Around 80% of the Muslim world are Sunni. The Sunni and the Shia, the split is connected to different understandings of who should have followed the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in continuing on leadership of the Islamic Ummah or nation. Today, there are differences in approach, there are differences in festivals and traditions, but ultimately, it's a religious split. That they're all are Muslim, all have the same basic tenets of faith, but there are differences politically between the Sunni and the Shia. Traditionally, the Shia are the oppressed, if you will, within the Islam in a very, very simplistic way. And again, we can see over here, there we are, Iran over here. So Iran, again, one of the other things that differentiates very often Shia communities from Sunnah or Sunni communities is the idea of a supreme religious figure who rules. So for example, Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran, we mentioned before, right over here, you can see a little slither of light blue over here, because despite being a small minority, Hezbollah, which are the largest, most powerful political and military force, almost in the Middle East, actually in the Arab world, but Iran is not strictly speaking Arab, so it's Middle East, but it's not Arab. But Hezbollah is Shia and is funded and supported and trained by Iran. The Hamas is Sunni and not Shia, but sometimes the enemy of one's enemy is one's friend. And so we have Iranian support for the Hamas and the jihad in Gaza, for the Hezbollah here, down in parts of Yemen. This is Yemen over here. So the Houthis in Yemen, you may have heard rockets being fired from Yemen towards Israel, which were intercepted by the Americans. So you have the Yemen over here, you have the Houthis in Yemen who are also Shia as well. In Iraq, we have issues now starting to develop more with Shia militias inside Iraq also, and connected to American troop positions. The interesting part of the story over here, actually you can see in purple, which is the sort of on the fence, is Qatar. So the Emirate of Qatar over here, which is majority Sunni, but interestingly, the Qatar and Iran share a major gas field. Because of the Arab world, the Saudi Arabia and the much of the Arab world placing a boycott on the Qataris for what they perceive to be supporting insurgency, Islamic insurgency movements, the Iranians supported the Qataris during that time, and they share an economic interest in the gas field. At the same time, there is a major American base here in the Middle East inside Qatar. And of course, Qatar wants to be accepted on the world stage. If anyone watched the World Cup, the soccer football World Cup. So Qatar essentially is, on the one hand, connected to the Iranians, has been supporting insurgency movements, but on the other hand is also allying itself or moving itself towards the West and the Americans. It's involved, we understand at the moment, the 2 hostages that were released on Friday were negotiated by the Qataris. And this is something that Hamas specifically thanked the Qataris for their involvement. So we can see a lot going on here, which is an awful lot bigger than the Hamas. So on the one hand, the immediate, and Israel military is stating that its immediate battle is with the Hamas in the south, but it's possible, and I certainly hope that's not the case, that this could develop into something much bigger if the Iranians seek to exercise their influence in a much larger fashion in the other parts of the axis that they have been developing in Syria. The Alawites, I should have mentioned Assad in Syria, who largely has the Iranians and the Russians to thank for still being in power also today. So when we're, for example, hearing on attacks on airports inside Syria, this is because of an Israeli fear that weapons are being moved to Hezbollah through Syria because there are Iranian boots and Hezbollah boots on the ground inside Syria. Very complicated situation, but just to understand that many people don't think about the geopolitics, there are many things going on that none of us have any idea are going on at all. I can say that personally from things that I've discovered from people that I've spoken to and people that I've guided as well, involved in the security establishment in various countries. But what we certainly do know is that what's going on between Israel and Hamas is not limited specifically to Israel and Hamas. Again, Hamas doesn't represent all of the Palestinian people, and at the same time, the Hamas are not necessarily representing the interest of the Palestinian people at all, but more representing the interest of those from further afield. I mentioned the 2 hostages that were released on Friday. There are 2 American citizens that were released on Friday. I can tell you also, by the way, right now, and I was listening to the Israeli news just before we came onto the session right now, very sad, talking about potentially waiting longer for an incursion, a land incursion, in order to try and secure more hostages to be released, and talking about a hierarchy of hostages. And these are the kind of things people are talking about. Why are these being released? Why are these not? What about the elderly? What about the babies? Why should I heard a heartbreaking someone today, and again, whether it's right or wrong, you can understand feelings of one of the mothers whose child is in Gaza saying, but just because my daughter doesn't have a foreign passport, does it make her less important? So the idea also that the hostages are not, the part of the issue with the hostages is also the psychological warfare that's also being played as well. I'll say a few words about the rest of the Arab world, because I've just spoken to you about the fact that the majority of the Arab world, if we're speaking about Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and much of the Emirates, are incredibly fearful of Iran, and that's one of the reasons why they've been moving towards Israel, which is one of the reasons why the Hamas, as part of the Iranian sphere, have taken the act of trying to push Israel further away from the rest of the Arab world. That said, the Arab governments don't always necessarily, and this is putting it mildly, represent the feeling on the Arab street. And so all across the Arab world, we've been seeing protests against what they see as Israeli brutality, genocidal actions, and so forth in the language of what we're hearing across the Arab world. And for example, when we heard about the hospital massacre or not, that we'll speak about in a few moments' time, this was condemned by Sisi, we see here in Egypt, by the King of Jordan, by Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. All refused to meet, for example, Biden when he came to visit. And so trying to understand the reactions of the street. Should also mention, by the way, we're talking about looking at Gaza for a moment, that remember that the border over here of Gaza is a border with Egypt. Israel is telling people to move over into this area. One of the questions that I was asked is, why are people not talking about Egypt? Why is Egypt not taking Palestinians into Egypt? It's a good question, and it's very, very complicated. And I will give 2 different answers, I would suggest. One answer is that part of the Palestinian trauma is the trauma of becoming refugees. And so the idea of taking Palestinian refugees, being part of the process of taking Palestinians out of Gaza and being seen as complicit in taking Palestinians out of Palestine, so to speak, and whether they will go back, this is something that is very problematic for the Arab world. So this is on the one hand. On the other hand, we were speaking before about the fact that Palestinians across the Arab world, refugee camps, not provided citizenship, used essentially in many ways as a tool, a stick with which to beat Israel for many years before peace agreements were signed, for example, between Egypt and Israel, Jordan and Israel. And remember that the Palestinians have been living under Hamas rule for a significant amount of time, that most of the Palestinian population is very young. Whether they are members of Hamas, many Palestinians are affected by this very extreme ideology. It's possible that if refugees will come in and across to Egypt, it's quite possible that the Hamas will blend in and move into Egypt. The Egyptian government, it's a military dictatorship that took power away from the Islamic Brotherhood. Remember, the Islamic Brotherhood and Hamas are part of two sides of the same coin. So the Egyptians are not interested in this wording, and not my wording, in importing a potential Islamist problem into Egypt. And this is also part of the reality. Likewise, Jordan, which already has a significant Palestinian, some say between 40 to 55% of the Jordanian population is Palestinian. Remember, the area was also very briefly part of the Mandate of Palestine. I'm going to move very quickly across to the West Bank. I apologize for taking a very long time, but obviously a lot to speak about and a lot of questions that you had. I'm going to move across to the West Bank very, very briefly. I'm not going to speak again about Oslo and so forth, but I'm going to speak a little bit about Abbas. I was asked a question, what is going on in the West Bank? So someone asked me the question. It's been very quiet, albeit that that there was a strike today on what Israel claims is a position of Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists who were hiding and storing weapons and preparing an attack in the area of a mosque in the Palestinian refugee camp in Jenin. We were talking about the refugees earlier on. And there have been protests, there have been rallies, but largely speaking, it's been relatively quiet. I was also asked about settlers. So I will just say a word and say that over the last week, we have seen Israelis living in the West Bank in certain settlements, those with more extreme nationalist and religious ideologies, who have been committing crimes and attacking Palestinians. And again, I can speak personally and say that I'm aboard by it. I think it's absolutely terrible. I think it pushes people further away. And again, whether it's not being dealt with because it's not in the interest of the government or because of the fact that the government is at war, but this is certainly something that is going to need to be dealt with. Coming back to the idea of the Palestinians in the West Bank, just a few words to say is that some of you joined me on Zoom in 2021, quite a lot of you actually, and we were talking about Israel and Hamas going at it in 2021. And we were speaking about the fact that back at that time, Hamas claimed that the reason that they were firing rockets at Israel was over Al-Aqsa, the same Jerusalem, like we're hearing right now. The reality, and that which you will hear from also the majority of Palestinians, is that much of the reason between the conflagration of the flare-up in 2021 was because the Palestinians were going to go to the elections. And when the Palestinians were going to go to the elections in 2021, the polls said Hamas were going to win in both Gaza and the West Bank. Ultimately, the elections didn't take place. Again, Israel didn't allow Palestinian polling stations to be set up in Jerusalem. The Palestinian Authority, led by the Fatah movement, the opponents of the Hamas, said they were very angry with Israel for not allowing Palestinians in Jerusalem to vote, and therefore they're going to have to cancel the elections. Of course, the reality was that is the fact that they could not vote in the elections in Jerusalem. They could go to the West Bank, but not in Jerusalem. The Palestinian Authority said Jerusalem is our capital and should be our capital. Israel said Jerusalem is Israel's capital, and we're not going to hold Palestinian Authority elections in an area that isn't under the Palestinian Authority. Ultimately, it was an arrangement that allowed the Palestinian Authority to blame Israel and allowed the Palestinian Authority to cancel the elections and not lose to Hamas. And so the situation in the West Bank is incredibly complicated because, as I mentioned before, put aside whether people support Hamas or not. And again, support for Hamas may not necessarily always be because of the radical Islamist anti-Semitic ideology. Can also be because of the fact they are seen as a viable alternative to the corruption of the Fatah and the existing control structures of the Palestinian Authority. We can put this aside. What we do know is that in the West Bank, where Israel has security presence, the security presence ensures that the Hamas will not take over in the West Bank. But the presence of Israel also marks Abbas out as potential collaborator. And so there was an interesting case, for example, in Jenin, where someone was, there's an organization there called the Lion's Den, which is a very group of disaffected Palestinian young men with lots of weapons supplied from overseas. A lot of the radical activity comes from them. They found a Palestinian man that they believe was collaborating with the Israeli authorities, and they lynched him, they killed him. And when they were asked, why didn't they, instead of killing him, since collaboration is against the law in the Palestinian Authority, helping Israel, why didn't they give him to the police of the Palestinian Authority? And the response from the members of the Lion's Den was, why would we give a collaborator to the collaborators? So Abbas is in a very difficult position because on the one hand, he needs to condemn and he needs to, for example, send out official Palestinian Authority document to the mosques this weekend, this past Friday, with very extreme phrases like we read before about Jews hiding behind trees. This is coming from the Palestinian Authority right now this past Friday. On the other hand, if Abbas will not be able to make pronouncements that condemn Israel and support what is perceived by many Palestinians to be an act of resistance, the barbaric acts that the Hamas performed, then potentially this will undermine him and potentially see him lose power in the West Bank. So it's a very, very, very complicated situation, and I only very much touched the surface of it. I'm coming towards the end, but I am going to answer the question I was asked about what's going on in the world. So I'm going to come to the international press. I mentioned before the hospital incident. I don't know if everybody here knows what I'm speaking about, but back on October the 17th, it seems like years ago, there was a reporting of an Israeli strike killing up to 500 people. Again, here we've got the New York Times, hundreds killed in Israeli strike on Gaza hospitals, and so on and so forth. And this is what was reported in the press. The source for this report came from the Gaza Health Ministry. For those that don't know, Gaza, as we mentioned before, is completely and utterly under the control of the Hamas. So the Gaza Health Ministry is Hamas. So the source for what took place was the Hamas, and the reporting of this incident essentially quoted Hamas. Later on, there started to be more questions over exactly what took place. Israel has claimed that actually it was not Israel, that it was a misfired rocket from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad who were fighting alongside the Hamas. They brought what they believed showed evidence that this was the case. Israel's military is saying that since the beginning of the conflict on October the 7th, 550 Palestinian missiles have fallen on the Palestinian population in Gaza. This is what they are expressing. Nonetheless, it took a very long time before the press started to suggest that there were multiple narratives. Be trying to be diplomatic, and right now there are still certain organizations, Al Jazeera, for example, which is a Qatar we were speaking about before, based organization, which is still suggesting that it seems likely that Israel killed. In the meantime, 500 people seems to have gone down to somewhere between 20 and 50. Someone asked me about Christians there was I think I have it over here. It was the church that I showed you at the picture that I showed you towards the beginning. Here we go. If you look very closely here, you can see a church right over here. This is the Church of St. Porphyrius. It's one of the oldest churches in the world, and it's right over here. And so again, there was a suggestion that the church had been, that a missile had directly struck the church. Later on, the following day, when it was possible to see, it became clear that, like where the hospital rocket had struck in, whatever had struck in a car park and not the hospital, and there was questions over who had done it. Here you can see Israel claimed that the strike here was on a Hamas facility, and evidence on the ground showed that the building that was struck was not the church, but actually the building next to the church. So there's a lot of disinformation and a lot of things coming up. And what I will say, and again, some of you, if you followed me on social media, I was really upset on October the 17th. First of all, I was really upset because I thought 500 Palestinians had died. And I thought 500 Palestinians dying is completely and utterly abysmal and awful and horrible and terrible. And I was incredibly worried. I was also incredibly worried because I immediately thought, if Israel has killed 500 people, what is this going to do in terms of reactions to Israelis and Jews around the world? And this is one of the reasons why most Israelis, and I will count myself amongst them, feel that much of the international press is being very irresponsible in the way that they are reporting the conflict, because there is an awful lot of fog in terms of what is happening, a lot of disinformation, and that it's very important to get things right. And one of the reasons, particularly in this conflict, important to get things right is because I would imagine that in almost every country in which all of you are living, that the events which are taking place here in Israel-Palestine are affecting people on the streets of the countries in which you live, whether it's terror attacks, whether it's Islamophobic attacks, whether it's anti-Semitic attacks, whether it's the rhetoric that is making, for example, Jewish people fearful to step outside of their houses. All of this is going on. And I would also suggest even that here, when this was taking place on the eve of Biden's visit, that perhaps the fact that this immediately came out as categorically Israel's responsibility meant that it was necessary for the leaders of the Arab world to condemn this wholeheartedly, and potentially, maybe it's one of the reasons why Biden's schedule on the trip looked like it did. It's possible that perhaps had the international media reported this in a different way, perhaps also the actual events on the ground also would have been different. So I think this is important to mention. Also, I was asked about the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel, and I mentioned that at the very beginning. So as I come really towards the end of the presentation now, I promise, I want to show you a video. The video is from yesterday. The video is from London, and I want to show you the video because one of the questions that I've been asked by you, one of the questions I'm asked a lot in general, is where is the boundary between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism? And again, I mentioned to you before that criticizing Israel is not in itself anti-Semitic, in my opinion, in any way, shape, or form. You can be incredibly critical of Israel. At the same time, if you are critical of Israel in a way that contradicts the way you can relate to any other situation or place, or you focus in an inordinate way, then something is different. Something is very, very different. So I'll show you a video because one of the things that many of you have been hearing is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And again, if we look at a map of Israel, the river is the Jordan River over here, and the Mediterranean Sea is over here. And from the river to the sea is speaking about the area encompassing all of Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. The idea that all of that area will be Palestine, will be free. What exactly does that mean? Well, I'll show you a video now, and I would suggest that this is what most people that understand the meaning of the words they're chanting, and certainly the way that most Jews would feel that this means, is can be seen in the video that I'm going to show you now.
The only way.
Hold on.
The only way there will be peace is until Israeli apartheid is smashed. The only way there will be peace is if Israel is torn down from the ground up, and the Palestinians have the right win back their right to self-determination, and fight racism, fight imperialism will be on the streets every week, every day, every year, until Palestine is free from the river to the sea. That is what from the river to the sea means. It means there is no Israel, because there can be no peace while there is an Israel. It means the Palestinians take their destiny into their own hands, and they smash the disgusting occupation force.
It's a pretty extreme video, but this is also part of the reality about the feelings that are engendered by what's going on here in this region. And again, speaking as someone in Israel who is on the one hand incredibly scared for my own and my family's and my people's physical security, also incredibly worried about the fate of innocent Palestinians that are caught up in all of the violence that has been brought on by the Hamas incursion into Israel. But I'm also incredibly worried about you all, regardless of who you are and what religion you are and what your politics are, but the extremes that are happening in societies and how they're affected by what is going on here. Just as I mentioned, coming to an end, is I was asked what essentially, like, what about this strange situation where we see a lot of the progressive and liberal left seemingly allying itself with Islamic extremism, or excusing the actions of Hamas and so on and so forth. And I think that, again, there are people that are far more well versed in these things than I am. But certainly I do believe that a lot of people are not necessarily anti-Semitic, or don't believe themselves to be anti-Semitic, or want to be anti-Semitic, but simply understand that when they see one group which is defined as oppressed, or seeing the world in very simple binary terms, where either you're right or you're wrong, you're the oppressed or the oppressor, you either have power or you have no power. And again, in terms of anti-Semitism, which is a very unique racism, because much of anti-Semitism is based on conspiracy theories of Jews having great power. So it's in a very strange situation. A lot of racism is based on putting someone down as weak and unimportant, whereas anti-Semitism is often based on the idea that Jews are in a sort of more powerful than they are in their very small numbers that they are in the world, which I think is a paradigm which is very difficult to deal with when you're looking at the experience of racism in many other ways. So I think this is something important to be said. I would also argue that one of the difficult situations as well in dealing with the situation, I'm going to put a controversial picture up over here, is because of these very, very disparate narratives. That a Palestinian narrative is a narrative of indigeneity. It's a narrative of losing one's land or having one's place taken away. It's of Nakba. It's of leaving one's home and fearing leaving one's home again. This is a Palestinian narrative, and it's a very, very strong narrative, as we were speaking about. On the other hand, and it's not either or, that Jews around the world, for the most part, still connect to the traditional idea of what Judaism is, that Judaism began, again, I'm looking at these maps over here, but in this piece of land, regardless of whether it's green or white, in this piece of land is essentially where the Jewish people developed into a nation. And so this idea of Jews are a religion, but if you don't believe in God, and I've said this to many of you, if you don't believe in God, it doesn't make you any less Jewish. So the idea of a secular Jew, it's not oxymoronic. It's something that's eminently possible, because Judaism isn't just a religion. It's not just a faith, but it's a people and a culture and a history and a land and a language. And it's all of these things together. It's essentially it began as an ethnic or tribal group with a shared basket of values, way of looking at the world. Again, Judaism is complicated, but it's very difficult to put Judaism in an analogous sense alongside other religions. It's not better or worse, but religion is only one part of Judaism. So if on the one hand you see yourself as indigenous on the Palestinian side, and you say Jews are only a religion, and Jews will say, well, actually, we're not only a religion for the most part. Most Jews in the world will say, we're a people. Am Israel, we're a people. And this is the land that the people are from. This is the land that we've always been tied to. So the idea, for example, on Palestinian, often you'll hear the idea of settler colonial. You may have heard of these terms. Now, again, for many people, when they think of settlers, they think of Israelis living over the Green Line in the West Bank. But the term settler colonial refers to people living inside the state of Israel. A lot of people were speaking about attacks on Jewish settlements on October the 7th, because if Israel shouldn't exist, then all Jewish people living in Israel essentially are settlers. This is the conception. For many Jews, nothing could be further from the truth. How can you be a settler on a land that you're from? How can you be colonial when you were reforming oneself in one's homeland and were not sent there from to colonize a place and bring resources back, but actually to be in the place where you can be safe and secure and express your identity? So Jews have a very different way. There's no conversation to be had, because if you're a Jew who believes that Palestinians aren't a people, you're never going to be able to talk to the Palestinian. And if you're a Palestinian who won't countenance the fact or that Jews are people, and also have a strong, compelling native or indigenous narrative, because there are two compelling narratives here, then there's no conversation to be had. And I will also go a step further and say that if you believe that Jews are merely as a faith group, then this helps to justify why you would suggest that one nation and one nation only has no right to exist in amongst the nations of the world. Again, one could argue that this is anti-Semitic, because especially in progressive speak, the idea of defining for someone else what they are is something you should never do. But what we're seeing is a lot of people finding it very easy to define for Jews what they are in the name of progressive. So the reason I put this map on the screen in front, because I think it's a perfect example. Anyone who's been involved on campus politics, you're going to see a lot of this map. So the map that you're looking at here is often referred to as the map of disappearing Palestine. So it's essentially saying this was Palestine before 1947. It was, the green is all Palestine. In 1947, in the partition plan, suddenly lots of Palestine disappears. Then between 1949 and 1967, all the Palestinians have is this area. And then in the Oslo Accords, in the peace process, actually, it gets even less, because now the Palestinians are only controlling these areas. This is, again, a very compelling argument if one is looking at it on the surface. On the other hand, if you remember earlier on, we showed you Ottoman Palestine, because it was Ottoman Palestine. There was privately owned land. The green over here is not privately owned Palestinian land. The white is privately owned land by Jews. Privately owned land by Palestinian Arabs is somewhere in the green. So what you're looking at here is not a state of Palestine, and it's not land that was Palestine. But this is the argument. This map that you see over here is utterly irrelevant, because it was rejected by the Arab Palestinians at the time. So actually nothing was lost, because nothing happened over here. Strictly speaking, this was not Palestine between 1949 and 1967, because Gaza was occupied by Egypt and the West Bank was annexed to become part of Jordan. So again, we start to see, and I don't want to go into the politics of who's right or wrong, because I'm very critical of people on all sides. But again, the map is it's often used as a tool to show settler colonialism and genocide and so on and so forth, when the reality is actually showing this map is denying the narrative of the other side. And in the same way that I disagree with the idea of Jews denying the narrative of Palestinians, I also have a big issue with Palestinians denying the narrative of Jews. The only one I was asked if there's going to be a solution, and again, I think we're very far away from that right now, but the only solution can come when we don't completely disassemble the narrative of the other, like we heard the gentleman do, gentleman, not so gentle, on the video a few moments ago. Just really much as we're coming to an end now, and really coming to an end now, I wanted to talk about what happens next. So first of all, if you're asking me how is this all going to end, I don't know. Right, first of all, I don't know if things are going to inflame on the northern border. I don't know if we're going to be dragged into a regional war. I don't know if it's all going to be just in Gaza. I know that Israel's intention is to change the strategic and security paradigm in Gaza. Whether that means the Palestinian Authority coming into Gaza, whether that means some kind of international, I don't know. I really, really don't know. I can tell you that I think it's going to be, on the one hand, very difficult, even more difficult to arrive at a two-state solution when the Palestinians are going to see even more death as a result of what is coming, and how that is going to make them feel about Israel, and the significant number of young people that are going to have that trauma as part of their identity. I think that's going to make it even harder on the Palestinian side. And I think the idea of even Israelis left of center thinking about what will happen if there is Palestinian autonomy complete without any Israeli presence in the West Bank, what that means. And I can tell you, I didn't take a picture. I told you before that I live very close. I'm going to take this picture off the back of the screen. I told you that I live very, very close to the West Bank. When I look out my window, I can see Palestinian villages. I'm not over the green line. I'm not in the area that was controlled by Jordan before 1967, but I'm very, very close. I'm about a mile away. And so if there was Hamas, if there were elections and Hamas were to have won in 2021 and Israel was not present in the West Bank, and then this would have been potentially happening right next to where I live. And so I think this, and that's the reality. So I think that for a lot of Israelis, the idea, some people will say that the idea of a two-state solution is dead, because who could possibly take that risk? However, I'm going to flip it on the other side and say that up until now, for the last 20 years or so, the security conception, or the conception, has been to manage the conflict. That maybe it's possible to decide not solve it, not to officially not solve it, but just to not deal with it. Live with a certain amount of rockets and live with a certain amount of terror, but develop a strong economy and a good way of life on an Israeli side, and to live, and that it's good enough. And I think that what's happened here has, on the Israeli side, been a huge slap in the face to this conception that it's possible not just to decide not to deal with the Palestinians. On the flip side, Israel cannot deal with the Palestinians unilaterally. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. It doesn't mean it was the wrong decision, but maybe doing it unilaterally created the conditions for Hamas to take over. Israel, for those people that wish Israel to not be in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, for people will say for an occupation to end, I think what's also happened here is reinforce the idea that Israel can't end it on its own. It's not possible to say Israel needs to end it now. Israel can't end it unless the Palestinians are prepared to end it as well, in a way that allows Palestinians to have freedom and a state, but that free state that hopefully they will create in the image of freedom and democracy, I hope, isn't one that's going to destroy Israel. So I don't know where things are going to go. I feel like in every presentation I have to give some kind of moment of hope. So on the one hand, I will say, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm worried for the Palestinians, but I hope at least that if what happens is getting rid of Hamas, and Hamas are abject and evil and are terrorists in my mind, that I hope that it will enable them to have something better. And I wanted to say that I mentioned that up until October the 7th, Israeli society was pulling itself apart. I remember for years as a guide, we used to say, if we will ever solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then we will eat ourselves. And what's actually happened is that even without solving it, we've been eating ourselves. And one thing I can say is that we have seen people coming together since October the 7th, suddenly feeling like, what were we doing? Was that really important? Fighting about the judiciary and fight. I really hope that after all of this finishes, however it finishes, that we will remember how we felt that none of it mattered. The picture you see here, by the way, this is Yair Golan. Yair Golan is a very decorated general in the army. He was perhaps on the path to becoming the chief of staff. He became a very prominent figure in the anti-government protests, and he was castigated by the right as a traitor, as someone who was against the country. On October the 7th, when he heard what was happening, he got in his car, his small little car, and he drove down on his own towards the Gaza border. He picked up a gun and a helmet. He then wandered off and grabbed soldiers that he saw, formed them into a unit, and basically went to take on the terrorists. The gentleman that you see over here, he is an ultra-Orthodox Zaka volunteer. Zaka are a group of ultra-Orthodox organization that basically takes care of burial. In this case, they're always the ones that come to terror attacks to pick up pieces of human beings. And in this picture that you see over here, it's actually from a video where he was driving along, the Zaka volunteer, and he got out of his car and he came up to Yair Golan and he said, I want to apologize to you because the extreme propaganda that was coming from certain elements on the right wing made me hate you. That I voted for Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a politician on the nationalist Israeli right, religious right. Said I voted for him and I believed that you I believed you were a traitor, and I want to apologize to you. And he gave him a hug. So this is the picture that we see over here. I was also asked about what's going on in Arab society in Israel. I'll tell you that in a poll that took place from Hebrew University, over 80% of the Arab population of Israel support some form of reaction to Hamas and condemn unreservedly what Hamas did. I can tell you, and again, I put some suggestions on places that you could potentially volunteer to. And one of the things that I'll give or donate to, one of the places was a bicycle salesman in an Arab town who immediately donated what he had. There are many ultra-Orthodox that have been enlisting even in ways that one couldn't have imagined before. There are many that by the way, this tragedy affected not only Jewish Israelis, of course. Israel is a multicultural society. There are, I think, somewhere in the order of 40 Bedouin that were killed by rockets, that were killed by terrorism. There was just unbelievable stories. I will tell you that actually there was a little boy who's I think he's now just started talking, but he was in one of the greenhouses in the agriculture by the Gaza border when the Hamas terrorists came across. And when they saw his father, they said, if you're with the Jews, then you're worse than the Jews, and they shot him. And the little boy was saved, and he's now come round. So I think that this is going to be a very interesting also time in Arab society, because there is increasing voices where in 2021, remember, for those that joined me in 2021 or those that were followed along with what was going on, there was an awful lot of unrest between Arabs and Jews in mixed cities because of the fighting between Hamas and Israel. None of that has happened on this occasion. There are a few isolated incidents of people that have made pronouncements, but ultimately, overwhelmingly, Arab Israeli society has been part of this. I was asked about Christians, and I mentioned one of the rockets that came across from Hezbollah into the north of Israel landed in Fasuta, which is a Catholic, Maronite Catholic Arab village. On the day that the war began, I immediately sent a message to a friend of mine who's an Aramaic Christian who lives in Jish, also in the north, both she and her son have both been enlisted into the military. So again, I think if there are stories of hope that are coming at this time inside Israel, then it's about the fact that many sectors of Israeli society that haven't felt a common pull together are feeling a common pull together. And I hope that that will continue to exist, and even more so after all of this dies down. I'm going to stop there. For those that would like to stay on, and I'm aware of the fact that it's almost 2.5 hours, I'm going to answer some more questions that are here. I'm just going to stay on as long as I see that there are people that are still here. So I'm going to answer some questions, but I want to say thank you to all of you for joining me. Whether it's the suggestions that I made, or whether it's in another way, if you want to donate, if you want to help and support, then I encourage you to do so. I think if you want to help people in this region, the best thing you can do apart from this is to read, to understand, to challenge, to try and encourage people that come with an extremist point of view, one way or the other, to consider what they're saying, not to jump to conclusions about things, not to speak with really strong rhetoric, to try and encourage people to understand that this is much more complex and much more nuanced. So I'm going to thank you, but I'm going to stay on and I'm going to answer. So I'm just going to read over a lot of questions that I've been sent. So, okay, so someone asked me about, I didn't mention that Egypt has blockaded Gaza. So I think I maybe didn't speak about it categorically, but I did mention the fact that for the same reason that Egypt is now very reluctant to open the border between Egypt and Gaza is exactly for this reason, that yes, that the blockade in Gaza from 2007 has also been a blockade from Egypt for exactly the same reasons, essentially. The only time that the blockade was lifted by the Egyptians was after the Arab Spring, when an Islamic Brotherhood government came into power in Egypt and then was replaced after that once the Sisi government came into being. So I'm going to continue to read on. Yep, people have mentioned about settlers have been supported by the police and IDF when they attack Palestinians. Yes, it's a very complicated situation. I can say, again, personally speaking, for myself and many Israelis that I know, really angered and condemning the behavior by certain Israeli settlers that are behaving in a way which is unbecoming to the society we live in, or to Jewish values, in my opinion. And it is worrying because there is this idea that the Israeli police and Israeli army should protect Israeli citizens, but at the same time, what happens when those Israeli citizens are behaving in a way against people that are not Israeli citizens? It's problematic. I think I mentioned it before, and I think it's something that needs to change. That's my opinion. Okay, I was asked under what circumstances would I consider returning to the UK? I think I could have done. So for those of you that don't know me, you can hear that I have an English accent. So I grew up in the UK. My father is the least Israeli ever. Was born in Israel, and that's about it. And I've lived here permanently since 2004. My wife is not Israeli. She's actually Ethiopian, Jewish, Israeli. So I was talking before about the fact that Israel is a very multicultural society. And again, when we're talking about the politics of the progressive, there's also an idea about white and black. And the reality is that not all Palestinians are brown and black, and not all Israelis are white, and that things are a lot more complicated here. When I didn't think for a moment about returning to Israel. Perhaps I would have felt differently if I'd been living in the south and had got out by the skin of my teeth, and maybe I would feel differently if things will develop in a direction that I hope or I'm hoping won't happen. But even then, it would be simply about like thinking about my children's safety. But I think there is this idea that if you move, then the border comes with you to an extent. There is a very famous figure in pre-State of Israel Jewish yishuv sort of the creation of the state of Israel. His name was Joseph Trumpeldor, and Joseph Trumpeldor. Well, first of all, he allegedly said something for the British who've studied World War I poetry. He said something very similar to Wilfred Owen, that it's good to die for one's country. But he's also has this idea. He also is famous for a statement saying that it's something along the lines of, to bastardize his line, that wherever I lay my hat, that's where the border will be. And I think so. I think it's important. I will say, by the way, that there are, I gave a link to a place to donate to start to think about rebuilding from the ashes the communities that were destroyed. Be'eri, for example, was a kibbutz that was founded in 1946, before the creation of the state of Israel. I know that there have been a number of people from Be'eri that at least right now can't even think about going back to live there, and I totally understand. And I can't imagine what they're feeling in some of these kibbutzim, some of these villages where a quarter of the population have either been killed or captured. I can't start to imagine. Okay, so I was asked, how is life in Israel right now? Schools, markets, beaches. Israelis are incredibly resilient. So first of all, because Israelis have been living with this, I called it a tiftuf, the Israelis have been living with the occasional bomb, with the occasional murder, with the occasional lynching, with rockets relatively regularly. But there is an Iron Dome, which again, and I didn't mention it before, but we're speaking about the fact that Israel has invested huge amounts of money in defending its citizens. So the Iron Dome defense system, which shoots rockets out the sky, but it can't get them all, and that's why. By the way, over 7,000 rockets. I don't know if you know, over 7,000 rockets have been fired from Gaza since October the 7th into Israel. The reason that we haven't seen mass casualties in the thousands, like we've beyond the massacre in the south of Israel on the October the 7th, is not because the rockets haven't been fired from Gaza. It's because the rockets have been A, largely dealt with, B, Israel mandates that every new building in Israel for the last, I think, 15 to 20 years has to be built with a safe room. That is, the Home Front Command is giving instructions on Israelis to limit the loss of civilian life. So Israel is going through to great pains, which also can give this false feeling of normality. So I can say, for example, that my children have been off school, but right now my kids have just gone back to school on a very limited basis. They've been, but obviously with drills. But that's specifically where I live in the country, because I live in the country, part of the country where I haven't been bombarded with rockets from the north, and I haven't been bombarded with rockets from the south. We've had 3 rockets fall in our vicinity. I had 1 rocket that could be seen from my balcony that fell. So the situation here. I can also say that there are a lot of people that have gone through this horrific trauma, and they don't have PTSD. They have actual, I don't know what you would call it. Anyway, it's going on right now, and so there is some kind of, as far as is possible, sort of false normalcy, especially for the children. So that is whether it will be that way tomorrow, because everything is there is school for today. We're getting updates. Tomorrow there'll be school. The day after there'll be school. It's only for this time. Whether that will be the case all the way through, I don't know. Okay. Any more questions? Yeah, there were lots. More about from the river to the sea. Okay, I was asked a question about Jews who are anti-Israel. What do I think about them? Oof. So I'm going to give my opinion. I described Judaism before as something multifaceted. I've heard this idea. There's an idea of someone much more famous than me that talks about Judaism as a 5-legged table, and that if you take legs away, as long as there's 3 legs, the table always stands. So if you take away Israel, the table still stands. If you take away God, the table still stands. I think it's an approach that enables a lot of people that don't connect to everything to still feel part of the community. I don't necessarily think that it's an expression of what Judaism is, that Judaism innately is a people with a shared history, culture, land, religion, God, faith, language, etc. That's what it is. That's what it is. I don't think, and I think to an extent, and this is my opinion, that if we're talking about the Enlightenment and the development of modern political and social culture, that there has been a great emphasis on Jews to assimilate. And one of the ways that Jews can assimilate and be accepted as a small minority within societies is to be like everyone else. And one of the ways to be like everyone else is to put your Judaism inside the temple or inside the synagogue. It's to do it in the private sphere, and to be Jewish by religion like being Christian by religion or Muslim by religion, or and so on and so forth. And I'm simplifying it. And I think much of it is the way that Judaism in some communities developed in order to be accepted. And I think at a certain time, when you're perceived externally in a certain way, then you start to internalize it. If you're a liberal left-wing Jew and you're surrounded by people that prescribe to a certain way, then I think it's natural for people to start to internalize the way other people see you as the way you see yourself. I would say that I don't think that first of all, I think that for those that ask me about, for example, I know the if not now that went into, is it into the Congress building? Those that have been sort of Jews that have been creating anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian demonstrations. And again, those things shouldn't in theory be separate. I like to think you could be pro-Palestinian for Palestinian people and pro-life for Israelis as well. But I don't think they necessarily represent everyone. And I do know that there's a lot of Jews inherently tend to go to the left. They tend to be in progressive spaces. They tend to vote Democrat in the United States. Not all, but they, in high numbers. They tend to vote for the Labour Party in the UK. Traditionally, that's how Jews have been. And I'm speaking to a lot of people who are in these spaces, even people that are very critical of Israel and have been using a lot of the terminologies that you're hearing, like we heard on the video that I showed you before, who are suddenly don't know where to go. Because when they're looking around them and seeing people who purport to be liberal and peace-loving and anti-racist, who are justifying rape and gouging out babies from pregnant mothers and executing children in front of parents and parents in front of children and seemingly justifying it, I think I think this is going to be, first of all, I think this is a crisis for Jews on the progressive left, and I also think right now we're seeing a huge crisis in the progressive left. Period. That's my opinion. So many messages and so many questions. Okay, I think most of these were okay. So a few other questions that I had, and we've got some people. So some questions that I maybe didn't answer that I was asked before. Okay, I was asked about did Israel ignore Egyptian intelligence? It does appear on the surface that Egypt suggested that something was brewing, and there is a suggestion that this information wasn't taken seriously enough. I'm sure that all of this is going to come out. What I would say as an Israeli, on the one hand, it matters because on the one hand, we say, well, we should put aside all our political differences. We shouldn't call for the government we shouldn't call for Netanyahu, because apparently 80% of people, they say, it's according to one poll that I saw, don't think that Benjamin Netanyahu should continue as prime minister. On the one hand, we should be talking about these incredible political and military failures that have taken place. And some would argue that they should be discussed now, because should the people that are currently leading us, the ones that are responsible for the failure, be the ones responsible for leading us on? That's one argument. The general feeling here right now is that now is not the time for social disintegration, and to start, and that we need to get through this, and then put all this out there and find out exactly what happened, who's responsible, and make sure it doesn't happen again, and get everyone that was responsible to have responsibility taken. That's I think probably, I don't know if there are Israelis on here will probably be able to give that. I don't know if you would agree or disagree, but I think that's the consensus right now. Is there are people, for example, that are still demonstrating. There are people that are posting about blaming this and blaming that, and it's, and again, I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, but it's on a very small scale. Most people, and most people are speaking about getting through this, saying, I'm worried, I don't, they're voicing their some people are, for example, on social media are saying, he needs to go, but I'm not going to push it now. So it's getting said, but it's not being put, but it's not being rammed down people's throats right now, I think is the best thing I could say. I was asked about proportionality. I didn't mention it before. I was asked one of the questions that I was asked was, what should Israel do? Because on the one hand, if Hamas is operating from within a very, very condensed urban civilian area, and it is burrowing itself under the ground, and it is preventing many Palestinian civilians from leaving the areas in which it's fighting, or placing itself deliberately in those areas. If, for example, Israel has largely limited the amount of supplies coming into Gaza, and has said that the supplies will reopen when the hostages are released. So on the one hand, and I think that the IDF spokesman said, on the one hand, this could all be averted if Hamas come up with their hands up and give back the hostages, and it's all over, and the Palestinians don't have Hamas over them. But obviously that's not going to happen, because that's not what Hamas are. So considering what's happened here in Israel, and the security necessity for Hamas to be removed as a threat, which is a consensus across Israel, if the only way to do that is to go in, that means there's going to be significant Palestinian loss of life. So what's being said is that Israel must stop. There must be a ceasefire because too many Palestinians are dying. If there is a ceasefire, then Hamas remains in control. Hamas right now is firing rockets. I don't know if they've fired any since we've been on Zoom, but they're firing every single day. So this is not, and there's still infiltration. I mean, it's all still happening. So ceasefire isn't an option, and leaving Hamas where they are isn't an option for Israel. But I also understand the pain and anguish at seeing Palestinians die. The question is Israel completely and utterly responsible for the deaths of the Palestinians, or is Hamas responsible? Israel is saying that it's doing everything. It's messaging and informing and telling people to move. And again, as we saw in the video before, well over 100,000 Israelis have been moved from their homes. If you take a look at the size of Gaza, actually you can see, I'll show you here. Hold on. We go back onto the map with Gaza. Hold on. Let me show you. Where is that? This one, no. Too many maps. This one. So again, the distance. If we're looking at the distance from the very, very top, we're looking at the distance from the areas crossing here to the Wadi. So this area here, which is largely, again, Gaza City and the refugee camp area over here. The distance from here to here, somewhere in the order of 15 miles. And again, if the vast majority of the population is the area of Gaza City, which is the main area of operations over here. So again, it's going to be difficult. Again, it's going to be difficult to move, first of all, if Hamas is stopping people leaving. There are reports that, you know, they're taking car keys and taking identification and so on, or blocking roads. On the one hand, it's not an ideal situation. Clearly, there is no one looking to give those people a hotel or a place to live. And it's a difficult situation. Israel would argue that proportionality is really trying everything to get these people to move. And again, if you remember, a demand was made that within 24 hours. We're now on the 16th day since October the 7th, and no land incursion has taken place. So it seems clear that at least to me as an Israeli, that Israel is asking and saying, and I think a statement was made today, that at some point Israel is going to have to see civilians that remain in that area as part of Hamas, because 10 days or so has been given for people to move this, what is ultimately a relatively short distance past the Gaza River. So again, Israel would argue that it is incredibly proportional, but there are those also that would argue that the idea of asking people, many of whom are refugees, to move again is unconscionable and terrible, and so on and so forth. We're hearing the word, genocide bandied around a lot, which is complicated because on the one hand, we're seeing thousands of Palestinians killed. On the other hand, Israel has the military capacity inside a day to kill hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and it's not doing it because clearly Israel doesn't want to kill hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. It wants as few civilians to die as possible. And I would also say that, again, I would argue that that's because Israel values the life of the civilians as much as it can in the context of the war. But I would also argue that it doesn't help Israel for Palestinian civilians to die from a strategic perspective either. If Palestinians die, there is more pressure on Israel to stop. And if more Palestinians die, there is more support essentially for leaving the Hamas in place. So I think this is a very complicated situation. Again, proportionality is a problematic question, because if you're looking at how many people die, I would argue that that's not proportional. Israel shouldn't be looking to kill exactly the same number of people that were killed in Israel. That's not proportional. Nor should it be looking to rape the same number of women or bludgeon to death the same number of babies or so these questions of proportionality are complicated, especially when you have Israel protecting its citizens and Hamas placing them in harm's way. So I think I know in Britain there's a real obsession with proportionality, but I think it's a term that is really I'm not sure people responsibly really understand what could be meant by that, or nothing could be done. Thank you so much for joining me. I really hope it was interesting and useful. I apologize for it being long, but how could it not be? If you have any questions or thoughts or reflections or responses, I'd love to hear. And thank you so much for joining me. I really hope it was useful.